From what I can remember, it was never a scary house. From the outside, it looked normal enough. A little one-story with a well-manicured lawn, but it was owned by my mother's friend, who I lovingly called my aunt. As far as bad experiences go, I have none to recall prior to the day my aunt moved from the house. That day, however, is an entirely different story. My aunt and her husband had been on the rocks for a while, and I assume much heartbreak and harsh words had gone down within the house during their stay there. Maybe that attracted the spirit, I will never know. I don't recall much about the day my aunt and mother packed up the house, but I do remember being asked to go into the spare bedroom and retrieve some blankets. Now, the spare bedroom was a little secluded room in the front of the house that was accessible only by going down a hallway that also doubled as the laundry room. The washer and dryer sat in a closet, and above them was a little door to the attic. When I say door, it wasn't so much a door, but more of a piece of wood that sat on top of a square hole that opened up into the attic. I was far too little to reach this door. Even if I was to stand on top the washer and reach with my arms outstretched, it was impossible. You must remember that on this day, it was only me, my mother, and my aunt who were at the house. So imagine my surprise when I walked past the laundry to find the closet doors had been opened with the attic door ajar and light on. I had been in and out of the house all day and knew that not one person had been into the attic. My mother detests attics and my aunt won't be caught dead climbing up into one. So I found this all to be a little strange. I continued on my way to the room where I gathered the blankets and then headed back into the hallway. As I was leaving, I looked up into the open attic and there appeared a man. To this day, his appearance has always baffled me. For he was not so much a man, but an elf-like creature. He wore his hair long, and over it was a pointed hat. His clothes were tattered, and I can remember them being green. His skin was brown, and his eyes black. He was small. I don't want to say a midget, for I mean to offend no one, and so for the sake of being politically correct, I will just say that he was no taller than 3 feet. He was not a lean creature, and was actually quite round about the middle. He sat hunched over the square opening of the attic, looking down at me with a malicious grin. "Come here, little girl," he said, to which I did not respond. "Little girl, come up here." His voice was a harsh one, high-pitched, but at the same time, deep and threatening. Even as a child, I knew that what I was seeing was not human, and it was not good. I stood there in sort of a paralyzed state, staring at this thing in the attic for what seemed like an eternity, while he again and again repeated, "Come here, little girl. Come up here, little girl." Then, as if my brain was finally able to get through to my feet, I ran. I believe I would have ran through a wall of linebackers to get out of that house. I could hear him laughing as I took off. A dangerous laugh, one that to this day will raise the hairs on my arms and neck. I told my mother and my aunt what I had experienced, and they just as immediately wrote me off as having an overactive imagination. After much pleading, I got them into the hallway, where lo and behold, the attic door was open and light still on. The little man I had described to my mother and aunt had vanished. It was obvious that I was not the one to have done this, being that I was not of the right height to even reach the door, let alone the light inside, which hung another 3 feet above the opening. Needless to say, the packing was left unfinished, and the 3 of us promptly left the house with a phone call to my aunt's ex, informing him he could finish emptying the house himself. Whether my mother and aunt believed my story, or thought that a crazy person had taken residence in the attic, I don't know. I was never, and to this day am not the type of person to make up wild stories. I am a much grounded person, but I know that what I encountered that day was a spirit, demon, or ghost, and it was evil. Very evil. Why it had never even showed itself until then, I can't say, but it came to me and has been a part of my memory ever since. It was my first and only experience with actually seeing an entity. I still get feelings of being watched, and I can always sense when I'm not alone. But I've never ever again seen anything like that. Not even close. I am currently a freshman at Eastern Michigan University, which is only about an hour or less away from Detroit. My roommate and I live in a freshman dorm. I'm not sure how old it is in comparison to the others, but it's definitely not a new building, and I never really thought anything of it. I moved in first and lived by myself for at least a week back in August, and nothing unusual happened. I have never heard any strange noises or discovered cold spots, nor did I feel uncomfortable. In fact, I absolutely loved living there. A month or so after school started, my puppy died. My parents took me home so I could say goodbye before we took her body into the vet. I took her collar with me to college and collapsed it around my bed. And honestly, I was so upset that I had a hard time making it into my classes and spent most of my day sleeping. Eventually, I wasn't so emotional, but that's when things started to change. It all started on a cold November morning. I'd slept in until about 11 a.m. to check my email. I closed out of everything and locked the door. My roommate was currently at classes and she wouldn't have returned until about 1 p.m. I set my sweatpants on top of my laptop, but took the rest of my clothes with me. There isn't a fan in our bathroom, and the curtain doesn't keep water out very well. However, when I came back into my room, I noticed that my pants weren't there, where I had put them. They had been folded neatly and placed underneath my desk. I found this to be odd, but again, I didn't think anything of it. The door had been locked, no one had come in. We didn't have suite mates. I simply assumed that maybe they had fallen off and coincidentally landed under my desk, folded neatly. But what was more strange was that Google had been up, and someone had searched SI4U. I was slightly creeped out at this point, but the results were in different languages, and I didn't see anything particularly eerie about them. When my roommate had returned, I told her what had happened, and she searched SI4U as well. She got the same results back. We decided that maybe my sweatpants had just fallen off, but sweatpants can't double-click the icon for Firefox, go to Google, and then search SI4U before promptly jumping off the desk to the floor. Shortly after this, I lost internet connection. This is typical, but that particular page worked. We were creeped out by this, so I closed it. Nothing happened for a while. Later on that month, just before Thanksgiving break, I was once again alone in the room. My roommate had already left to go home earlier that day, and my dad wasn't going to pick me up until the next morning. I was trying to finish up some homework so that I wouldn't have to worry about it over break, when suddenly I started to hear music. The music sounded as if it was coming from a radio, but it was soft, and at first I couldn't tell if it was coming from my room or someone else's. Then it became loud. It was loud, and it was coming from my roommate's radio alarm clock. Who knew by Pink? I went over to her dresser to turn off her alarm clock, but the switch was already off. My next idea was to unplug it, but one soft tug and the plug was in my hand. My roommate had unplugged it before she left. I thought that maybe there was something wrong with the switch, so I turned it on in hopes that maybe it would shut off. But instead, the music became so loud it was stinging my ears. I took that battery out and it stopped. The next day, I told my roommate not to be surprised if she finds that the battery to her alarm clock is lying on her dresser. I told her that it went off when I was studying, and that was the only thing that would make it stop. I assumed that something might have been fired wrong or that there was a mishap, but then she said this. That's strange. The battery isn't strong enough to power the radio, just the alarm. I thought the radio was broken because it wouldn't turn on unless I had the entire thing plugged into the wall. When I was a kid, my sisters and my mom and I lived with my grandparents. The house itself always felt safe. One day, our neighbors got a new dog. It was an average-sized black dog, but since I was a kid, I guess it seemed bigger. My neighbor and I were friends, so we played a lot together, but his dog never seemed to like me. Every time I would go near the mesh fence, the dog would start to growl and show me its teeth. So eventually I stopped going to my neighbor's house. But at night, I would hear it barking at stray cats or other wildlife, and it would freak me out because it would sound so close. The dog was frightening to me. I just sensed something dark about it. The one day after school, I had heard from my mom that my neighbor's dog had died that morning. I was sad for my neighbor, but a little relieved. The rest of the day went by like normal. But that night, things got very strange. That night, after I fell asleep, I had strange dreams about that dog. In my dream, the dog was still alive, and it had jumped the fence and started to attack me, just out of everyone in my house. I remember being so terrified. I woke up, freaked out, then I heard a noise at the side of my bed, and I turned to see what it was, and it was my neighbor's dead dog sitting next to my bed. I can still remember those growling, solid yellow eyes staring at me. I started screaming, but I couldn't move. It's like my body was paralyzed by the dog's stare or something. After what felt like hours of horror, my mom finally rushed in the room to see what was wrong. As soon as my mom got to the bed, the dog growled and backed into the wall, leaving only its head and front legs exposed, and then just melted into the ground. My mom asked me if I was okay, and I asked her if she saw the dog. She told me that she didn't see it. She assured me that it was only a nightmare. But I knew it wasn't. I was fully awake when I saw the dog next to my bed. I never saw the dog at that house after that, but as the years passed, I knew that its presence was there at times. I lived in Georgia very briefly one time, and while I was there, I went to a psychic. I didn't actually tell her about the dog, but she told me that my intuition is strong, which I agree with. Sometimes I just know certain things, like who is going to call, or come ring the doorbell, or more recently, I've noticed that when I let my mind wander at work, out of nowhere, I will start seeing certain TV programs in my mind, and sure enough, when I get home and turn on the TV, the same program is on. I'm not saying that I'm psychic. I just think that the dog is somehow tied to my intuition. I've seen the dog recently. I live in Austin, Texas now, and almost a week ago, I was talking on my phone while walking home around 3 in the morning. Then I looked to the house at the end of the street, and I saw its shadow against the white door of the house. I could clearly make out the shape of the dog sitting face forward, and very briefly I saw those same glowing eyes. I kept my conversation going to keep myself from freaking out, but as soon as I got home, I went inside and locked the door. The very next day, my mom called me and told me that my great aunt was going to pass very soon. I didn't know what to think. Is the black dog a harbinger of death? Do I possess supernatural abilities that can't be seen by most people? Or am I just losing my mind? Please help me. He sees things. This story isn't really about me, but about my boyfriend and his family. To start, let me tell you a little about his family and where they live. My boyfriend Jackson has 5 siblings. He is the oldest. The second oldest is his brother Jake, who this story is mostly about. Jackson's family moved here when he was about 7 from Atlanta, Georgia, and they now live in a very old house where odd things always happen. I myself have seen a very distinct, non-human shadow in their home. Their home is very old, as I mentioned before. It was once owned by Al Capone's lawyer, which may have been something to do with the hauntings. There's also talk of someone having hung themselves in the house, along with a lot more history that they are currently unaware of. Jackson's brother Jake has seen a ghost of a little boy in their house on several occasions, but this is not the story that interests me.
Of course, I would like to investigate their house further, but what really gets to me is what Jake has claimed to see in the trees. The first time this happened, Jake was in his room lying on his bed with a teddy bear. He was about 11 at the time. He looked out of his bedroom window and saw a green, ugly, goblin-like creature sitting in the tree outside his window. They live in the woods. The creature was apparently hanging somewhat limp and looking down, but after a few moments, the creature suddenly looked up and startled Jake. When Jake looked away, he also noticed his teddy bear was gone. The first account is not nearly as interesting as the second. My boyfriend Jackson had gone outside because the dog was barking and growling up at a tree. Jackson went outside and tried to calm the dog down, assuming it was a squirrel or raccoon or something of to that nature. Jake then came outside and started screaming for Jackson to get away from the tree. Jackson repeatedly told Jake that there was nothing in the tree, but Jake said otherwise. According to Jake, there was a green, goblin-like creature climbing down from the tree and heading towards Jackson. Jackson had looked up the tree and all around it multiple times and saw nothing. I don't really know what to make of this. All of it seems pretty bizarre to me. I'm a firm believer in the paranormal, but do goblin things really exist? What are they really? I'd love some feedback on this.
This is the first time I've ever submitted one of my experiences online. I'm not a writer, so please bear with me if there are any grammatical errors or if it just seems like I'm rambling, just trying to describe almost everything as it happened leading up to the point of the story. Nor am I a confident speaker, so I haven't relayed this story to anyone besides my next of kin. I'm putting this story out there in the hopes that someone in my area has had the same experience and can shed some light on the matter, as it has plagued my thoughts for over a decade now. I live in Ipswich, Queensland, a smallish but steadily growing town on the outskirts of Queensland's capital of Brisbane, Australia. Just outside of Ipswich, entering into Brisbane, is the suburb of WAGON. WAGON is home to the notorious Woolston Park Mental Asylum. It has had a few different names before, but now I believe it's called the Park Central for Mental Health or something like that. Look it up if you'd like. Now, this incident took place in 2002. I was with two of my cousins who are brother and sister, and our friends who were three other girls from our church. We were all Samoan and come from families who attend the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Mormons, so any talk about the paranormal is laughed off and quickly hushed up in our households. I'm no longer a practicing member of the church, but at that same time I was 18 and still living at home, so I didn't mind going along to church sermons or events with my family every now and then. That night in 2002, at about 6 p.m., my cousins came over to my house to pick me up to go to a Mormon church dance for youth adults. They held those dances quite regularly. It was a regional thing, and young adults from all around the region would attend. Anyway, the dance was in a northern suburb about 45 minutes from Ipswich. After my cousins picked me up, we made our way to the homes of our other three friends to pick them up too. We get to the dance, mingle, and catch up with our friends from other regions, and at about 11:30 p.m., the six of us decide we'd had enough and made our way to the car. The car that my cousins picked us up in was an old van that belonged to their parents, but one the parents rarely ever used anymore. It was an old Mitsubishi, and at the very front where the driver sits, it was a little three-seater, so two of the three girls sat at the front with my guy cousin who was driving. The second row of seats were occupied by myself and my girl cousin, and the very last row of seats sat our other friend by herself. We left the dance, but instead of going straight home, we decided to go for a drive into Brisbane Central Since it was close to the chapel, we were just at. We parked the van and went for a walk around the city. It was a warm Saturday night, and walking past some of the nightclubs, we would see security guards that we knew standing outside the club doors, and we would have a chat with them. None of us wanted to go into the clubs, wearing our Sunday best, so we decided to just grab some ice cream and head home. If you live in Ipswich, and especially back then, you couldn't go to Brisbane and back without having to go past where you turn off to go into the grounds of the Woolston Park Hospital. Well, if you wanted to go quick way anyway. Armed with McDonald's chocolate sundaes, we made our way to the car and headed back towards Ipswich. When we got near Wakel, my guy cousin asks, "Do you guys want to check out Woolston?" It was almost 2 a.m. The two girls in front with him were scared but still said yes. His sister, who was sitting with me, rolled her eyes and dismissed what he was saying and carried on talking to me about her boyfriend. Our friend at the back didn't say anything. I don't really think she cared for what we did. And me? Well, my attitude towards it was just meh, because I had been to Woolston Park many times before in previous years with friends, hoping to see something spooky just like almost every other teen in the area did back then. I never saw a single scary thing, maybe except for the new runaway mental patient being escorted back into the grounds by security, while the patient shouted every curse word under the sun and in no particular order. The security staff would glare at us and tell us to leave or we'd get done for loitering and trespassing and such. Security was pretty tight there. They were either walking or driving around looking for thrill-seeking teens and driving them out of the grounds immediately. But this particular night, there was no one in sight. No little white security hatchbacks driving around with its high beams on, patrolling the grounds like there usually is. Back in 2002, the grounds were still pretty old. They hadn't added the new buildings and all the new street lights at this stage. It was still very dark. And where the new buildings now stand, there used to be just overgrown bushes and shrubs. We enter the grounds. It is dark, like pitch black. My cousin killed the lights to show us just how pitch black it was before his sister yelled at him to turn the lights back on and stopped acting stupid. We drive further into the grounds, my cousin and I yapping away about some crap, while our friend at the back decided to lie down and have a snooze. Suddenly, my cousin driving yells, "Shoot! Did you see that?" And we look over at the trio in the front. The two girls are huddling up to each other, shaking and just saying, "Oh my God, who the heck was that? What's wrong with him? I want to go home." I quickly turned my head back to look out the window of the van, and I could just make out, under the moonlight, a person who seemed to be walking with a limp, following us. My cousin driving said they saw someone standing against the bushes on the side of the road, just staring at the van go past. His sister laughs it off and says, "Oh, whatever. You're so full of it." To which he replied, "Do you want me to turn back?" The two girls in front with him are shouting, "No, no, no, no," while his sister and I are shouting at the back, "Yes, yes, yes." Because we were so busy chatting away, we didn't see this mysterious, spooky stranger. We thought it was probably just some homeless dude seeking shelter, or perhaps another adventurous patient and just wanted to confirm what we thought. But when my cousin turned the van and drove back the direction we came, there was no one in sight. His sister says, "See? I knew you guys are full of crap." But I tell her that I did see someone out the back window. She looked at me scared, but at the same time, it was like, "Oh, great. Not you, too." We keep driving that way to see if we can spot him again. After driving a few minutes and not seeing anybody,
which I thought was weird because I had seen him myself coming in our direction. We should have seen him as soon as we turned the car around. But nope, no one. We are driving through the darkness. The only light we have are the dim lights on the van. Suddenly, the lights fall upon a lone figure in the dark, his back turned to us. I knew it was him. How the heck did he get here so fast? I thought to myself. And especially with that slight limp, he is just walking slowly on the grass, on the side of the road. He doesn't even turn around to acknowledge the fact that there's a car behind him. I know I would have looked behind me if I were me at that time of night, in case people jumped out and attacked me, so I know whether I need to break into a run or something, but not him. It's like we weren't even there. From looking at the back of him, I kind of sensed that something was not quite right here. His clothes were tattered, dirty, and looked dated. Like early 90s style when some guys were trying to dress like Nirvana and various other grunge bands. Something just seemed so off about the whole situation. Like, yeah, I get that we can see people anywhere wearing old tatty clothes, but something about this just had a very weird and scary feeling I can't put into words. I remember that he wore those light-colored jeans and a flannel shirt, or what remained of those clothes anyway, and carried a corduroy backpack, which also looked like it had seen better days a long time ago. He was Caucasian, and as we got closer, I saw that his matted blonde shoulder-length hair was clumpy, stringy, just messy like it hadn't been brushed in a long time. Some of it tied back in a long, low ponytail. At the front, he had more of his ratty-looking hair coming down, framing the front of his face. He looked like he was in his early to mid-20s. We pull up beside him. My girl cousin told her brother to slow down, stop beside him. I think she was trying to prove that it was nothing scary. She scooted up to the window beside her and slid it open. You know how old van windows have to be slid across to open instead of being wound down? Sticks her head out and asks him, "Excuse me, are you all..." She didn't finish asking her question because by then he had turned around and was fully facing us. My God, I have never seen a living person look like that. She didn't finish asking her question because she slammed the window shut and just screamed her head off. And so did the two girls at the front. Just the loudest and most terrified screaming I had ever heard in my life. I was freaked out too, but couldn't scream as my cousin was pushing back away from the window with so much force that she was crushing me against my side of the van. I couldn't even let out a little yelp. When she moved to hit her brother in the front to make him snap out of what we were witnessing, according to our friends that sat at the front with him, he was just staring at the guy with his mouth open and just frozen while they are yelling at him to get us out of there. I was able to move and turned around to our friend, lying in the back seat telling her, "Oh my God, get up, you have to see this." She just lay there, crying with her eyes shut tight and telling me over and over, "No, no, no, shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up. I'm not getting up. I'm not getting up." Fair enough. I remember that, even though there was barely any light, his face stood out so much. Even though he was Caucasian, I've never in my life seen a person that color. I have friends who are super pale, and even they look like they've spent a few hours in a tanning bed compared to this guy. He was white, but frozen white, if that makes sense. But at the same time had a bluey, purplish tinge about him. I think it was his bloodless veins showing through his white skin. So hard to put into words, although I can see him clearly in my mind. His eyes, the rims of his eyes were red raw, but the whites looked glazed over. He might have had light blue eyes because you could have sort of make them out underneath the milky film that had now covered his pupils. His eyes were lifeless, for lack of a better term, but that's the word that comes to mind when I think of him. He had marks on his face, deep pink scratches that would have been bleeding but had since been washed. You know how in the movies when they pull those steel drawers out of the morgue so a person can have a look at the corpse? Very much like that. No, exactly like that. My cousin screamed because when he turned to face us, we realized it wasn't a typical living human face we were looking at. He didn't say a word, just opened his mouth and made a groaning sound. Then he extended a pale white hand towards the car, and then we just sped off. Now that I am older, I feel terrible for the way we reacted in driving off like that, screaming like lunatics. But we were a bunch of kids, and we were terrified. Now, I wish we had been so much more calm about it and had tried to communicate with him. And being back in 2002, cell phones with cameras were still rare. Most teenagers still didn't even have a cell phone, so we couldn't get a photo. I tried to search for any info related to this. Sadly, I found nothing. I tried searching for things like missing persons or unsolved murders around the area. But even if I did find his photo, I probably wouldn't even be able to recognize him, as he would look nothing the way he did that night. Was he a hitchhiker who met with foul play? Was he trying to make a shortcut through Woolston and came across a deranged patient? And if he was murdered there, is his body still buried there somewhere never to be found? The place has an awful history. After we left Woolston, we were still shaken. We went to the patrol station to fill up, and it wasn't until we got into the well-lit patrol station that our friend at the back finally sat up. I still remember her asking for a cherry-ripe chocolate bar with a quiet and scared voice. She sure was shaken up for someone who didn't see anything. She came over to my house with my girl cousin a couple of months ago, and we talked about it briefly. The other three that were in the car, I hardly see them anymore, except on Facebook, but we all agreed that what we witnessed was not of this world. We know what we saw. I still remember my guy cousin had to walk each of us girls into our homes as we were too scared to get out of the car by ourselves. Woolston Asylum has always been rumored to be haunted. My boyfriend and I drove through Woolston in 2011. That was my first time back there since 2002. It is so different now. Not at all as scary and menacing as it used to look. They've really cleaned it up. New buildings, and very well lit too. I always wonder who he is and how he got there. Some parents said that we saw a demon because we were hanging out so late at night instead of being good church kids and going home straight after the dance. I wonder if what we saw was someone who relives the moment of his death at every anniversary. I wonder if anyone else has seen him. That's why I wanted to share my story. It's been so long, and I still think about it all the time. For all of my life, I've lived in this average-sized house outside in the countryside. It's one of those places where nothing bad seems to happen, and the people all seem pretty normal. So, you can understand I don't share my story often. It started when I was young, around 5 to 9 years old, and continued until last year. When I was young, we had a dog, always barking and making noise about the littlest of things. He was one of those knee-high dogs, a West Highland Terrier, and he tended to get up in the middle of the night for various reasons. The first incident, I think, occurred on a mild summer night. I was living upstairs at the time, and just down the hall from my parents' room. As I was laying on my back in bed, I heard the sounds of footsteps around me, and assumed it was the dog. I was wide awake at the time, and listened to it walking from one side of the bed to the other. It must have lasted for almost 5 or so minutes. I told him to leave. The steps proceeded to go around me another time, stopping on my left, and I finally turned to look over the bed, telling him to get out of my room.
There was nothing there. I got up looking around the sides of my bed. Nothing. My room was a small rectangle, so small that the bed was pressed up against my wall, and I still smacked a knee on the corner. There's only one exit on my right side, so there was no way for him to get out, and there were boxes under my bed. I thought I had just gone to sleep and imagined it. Then, about 3 years, I'm guessing because I'm bad with time, things got a little freakier with a few incidents in between that might help shed light on this stuff. I was in middle school and had this nightmare. I awoke in the dream and heard my parents screaming for my help. I jumped up and ran out into the hallway. There, standing before me, were two things. They were black shadows of a tall man and a dog. The dog looked like something that I would draw if I was 5, and the man had grossly elongated limbs. Still creeps me out to this day. Anyway, my parents kept screaming in agony, and I approached the figure. The dog walked up to me and passed me in the hall. It seemed disinterested in me, but the man stood there. I tried to run around him, and he reached down around my waist. The pain felt like something stabbing and cutting under my skin, and I woke up in the middle of the night, eventually falling asleep again. That morning, I went downstairs to take a shower, and when I removed my heavy plaid pajamas, I saw a thin scratch that ran from under my tricep, down through my armpit, and across my stomach. It was nearly unbroken, and that's what scared me the most. I guess that's why I pretended it never happened. Maybe a year later, 8th grade, the footsteps came back. With our basement recently finished, I was living downstairs, and one morning during the week, I got up and started to play video games on my computer. I heard the footsteps start to walk around, just like they did before. It was like they were exploring my house. First off, we have no pipes over my room, and we have soundproof tiled ceiling above, so those footsteps had to be loud. Secondly, the dogs and cat were all out of the house, and so was my family. The footsteps continued, and at first, I thought maybe someone had broken in or one of my friends was playing a joke, so I waited. They would go all around my house and stop just at the stairwell and then walk again. They repeated this for about 5 minutes. A little freaked out, I grabbed my putter and went upstairs. If someone broke in, I would whack them. If one of my friends broke in, I'd whack them too. I went from room to room and, as you can guess, found nothing. When I went downstairs, I listened. Silence. As soon as I sat down, the footsteps began again. Not faster or slower, just an even, steady pace. I sat there, listening, and it would walk to the stairwell and stay just out of sight. I decided I would ambush it at the stairs and grabbed my putter. As soon as it came back, I stormed the steps. The way our house is shaped, it'd be impossible to get to the back bedrooms before I got up there. And of course, there was nothing. I searched every room, every closet, under every bed before I descended back into the basement. I thought how pissed I would be if the footsteps returned, because I always thought claims of physical events and the like were nonsense. Sure enough, I sat down and they came back. From 9 a.m. until noon, the footsteps kept going, trying to pretend it wasn't happening. I ignored them and continued to play video games. When my father came home, they stopped altogether. I have never heard them upstairs again. After that, I started looking to the paranormal more and more. I became interested in tarot cards, crystal balls, and all that stuff. I made a few friends in high school and left for college and came back home to work. After a year or so later, I started talking to this girl I had been friends with in high school. Let's call her Cass. Cass and I had fought and stopped talking to each other, mostly because she had feelings for me, and I didn't have any for her. She's coming to my house all the time after I let her back, and we have a few great times, but I still can't shake the feeling that she still likes me. Anyways, I finally let spill. I have tarot cards and stuff. She tells me that she has the ability to feel and see spirits, and I found that interesting. She was my friend, so I had no real reason to doubt her. But I will admit, it was pretty dumb to just blindly accept what she was saying, out of thin air. It started one night after I had a crystal ball out and she was in a trance. She pulled out her hair, pretending to be possessed, and then broke her trance. I started to get ill. My stomach just felt like it was churning, and I got up for the bathroom. As soon as I left the hallway, I felt better immediately and came back. As I turned the corner, the metal folding chair shifted and she seemed scared for a moment. It was dark and I thought she kicked the chair. I sat down in it and we talked for a moment, and then she left. I say pretend to be possessed because I talked to her mom privately and found out she would rip her hair out all the time as a kid. Eventually, she started making threats about demons taking her, especially when her new boyfriend came into the picture. He was one of my best friends, and we used to tell ghost stories together. Anyways, I told her his ghost story, and she used it to make him believe her. Her claims became much more wilder as we went on. On one particular claim, she stated that there had been a strange ceremony done in the basement, and I went down with her boyfriend to investigate. I didn't believe her at this point, but it was kind of fun, so I kept with it. We were in the room and I touched the floor where her boyfriend claimed his father did some sort of ritual. I could believe it, to be honest. There was no pentagram or anything strange at all. It was the same cracked blue floor when I first came over years prior. I double-checked to make sure there wasn't a double coating of paint and stood up. I told him I couldn't see anything that would indicate what she said, and he told me it was true. At that moment, there was this growling sound, and I thought it was from the vent above us or behind us. Then he jumped and swore, pulling up his sleeve, and a red mark started to appear. I'm not sure if this was faked. It would be fairly hard to time, or not, because I have always been skeptical by nature. Finally, the footsteps made their grand return after we started to part ways. I was lying in bed one morning, sprawled out under a heavy blanket, and pulling back the covers. I saw something at the foot of my bed. Had to be 5.5 feet tall, or taller, black streaks in gray fur, and a distinctly canine face on a humanoid body. Being 23-year-old man, I probably covered my face desperately, trying to convince myself that it was my blanket. The colors were very similar. Then, there were footsteps around my bed, like when I was a kid. They got really quick, side to side. I finally decided to attack it. Throwing back the covers when I was at the corner of my bed, I jumped forward, nearly off the bed, but there was nothing there. On all fours, I was dazed, and I was trying to figure out what the hell had happened. There was the thunder slap, side to side down the hall, up the steps, and the front door banged hard. A few minutes later, my father came in, and I was still in shock. I yelled up to him if he had heard anything or did anything. He didn't, and eventually, I got back to sleep. Later, I called Cass and her boyfriend, telling them about the events, and they called back later that night, reporting the sounds of scratching all over the house. There have been no events since then. Seeing as these incidents have been happening 3 or 4 years apart, I may be due for another visit this year or next. This story is similar to another, and you can see my effort to make contact wasn't successful. I was around 4 to 5 years old, living in the same house, where I saw my first ghost, my guardian. I could write an entire volume about my love for that house and garden. It was the best place to grow up in. One of my favorite nightly activities, bedtime procrastination techniques, was to climb onto my parents' bed while they were kicking back in the lounge room. I was pretty proud of this accomplishment because it was a waterbed, thus seemed near impossible to climb the shiny solid wood block fortress walls which chambered the water mattress. With the bed conquered, I could reach and switch on the bedside lamps. From here, I would pretend to be a panther prowling around the slow-moving surface until I eventually fell asleep. Fun times. One such night, I conked out and curled up to have a doze. I noticed a spider on the wall and recognized it as a huntsman. The huntsman, plural, is a large Australian spider which looks like a brownish hairy tree tarantula. Fun fact, the title of the movie, Snow White and the Huntsman, is highly amusing, but I digress. The huntsman on the wall was different. It was, for lack of a better description, colorful. I recall red and yellow patterns, and a slightly different brown. Its legs were thin and tapered. It only had 4 legs and was striking a star pose. There was something very strange about the huntsman. I stared at it in wonder. Another odd thing about Australian culture worth mentioning. Roughly 90% of Australians will tell you, huntsmen don't bite. They're harmless. Fact, they do bite. Fact, they're harmless in the sense that they want to get away from you. After or before biting you, either option is cool with Mr. Huntsman. I pay no mind reaction to the huntsman was based on wacky Australian conditioning. As I gazed upon this peculiar huntsman, my attention broke to a sound of murmuring voices, clear and deep but muffled. At first I thought it was Dad from the lounge, but the muffled voices were coming from a much closer source. I glanced around. Nothing. I looked at the huntsman. He's still there, chilling out. I was looking to the left when I saw out of the corner of my eye my parents' curtain wardrobe move. The curtain wardrobe was a wardrobe without a door. Dad put a curtain on the front as a makeshift door. This fabric had moved. I looked to the wardrobe curtain. The voices were still murmuring. Then came light, quick footsteps on the seagrass matting floor. I don't know if I could hear or understand what these voices were saying. What I can remember is one saying, "Quick," and "Hurry up." These 2 statements were particularly clear and deep. They sounded closest. I was in the middle of the bed. Slowly, I edged the end of the bed to where the wardrobe and voices were. I peeked over the end of the bed and saw what looked like an animalistic doll-sized toy looking out of the wardrobe toward the bedroom door. More murmuring. I looked to the door where this entity was looking and saw another similar-looking entity running out of the bedroom. I only saw this one from behind. Didn't see his face. He was wearing a yellow striped t-shirt and blue shorts. I looked back to the first one. He slowly slid behind the wardrobe curtain. Could swear he was looking at me as he did this. Then I heard something I still get the creeps.
thinking about. Shh. The loudest shushing I've ever heard. It decayed like the acoustics of a church, not a furnished average-sized suburban bedroom. Everything fell silent for the TV in the lounge. I made haste to the other end of the bed, as far away as possible, and hid under the covers. I wanted to yell for my parents, but I knew they'd just put me in my bed. The one running had turned the corner in the direction of my room. I definitely wasn't going in there. I peeked out from the covers and stared at the huntsman again. For some reason, this was comforting, like having company. I continued to stare at Fancy Pants Huntsman until Mom came in and carried me to my room. I demanded Mom remove all the doors from my bedroom. I don't know why, but I had an aversion to dolls after this. These critters didn't look like dolls, though. They looked more akin to soft toys. I don't know why I didn't freak out about the soft toys instead. I was curious yet calm, initially, to witness these beings. When the creature appeared to stare at me while slowly slipping behind the curtain, all calmness was replaced with fear. A fear I had been seen by it. The other time, I saw one of these guys was in the backyard. This time is less vivid and less eventful. I was around the same age. It wasn't too long after the first time. I was playing on the lawn, and I heard a deep, resonant voice again. It wasn't my guardian, who I used to hear sometimes. Immediately, I remembered the colorful huntsman again. I looked to the direction of the voice, which was coming from a part in the backyard, which was completely overgrown and gnarly. In the direct sunlight, I saw a light pink, skin toy-like thing with black eyes, nose, and frizzy sort of hair, wearing a sweater scamper into the wandering dew. Didn't hear or see anything more than that. The appearance of these creatures were similar, but each had their own unique look. The two whose face I saw both had black beady eyes, black noses, and red lips. Their skin looked like it was made of smooth cloth. Their hair was frizzy, as if it had been teased. I'd guess they were around 1 foot tall, varying in height and build. The one peering from the curtain wardrobe had dark brownish, orangey skin and bright red lips. I think this is the one that said, "Shh." I didn't get a look at his body, just his face poking out of the curtain. I'd say he was slight of build, going by his gaunt face. His nose was pointed. The one running out of the bedroom had darker brown skin. He had a heavier build and a much larger head. Didn't get a look at his face. The one outside was much lighter skinned, very pale pink, with a droopy red mouth and flatter nose. These weren't toys of mine. Never seen them before or since. I'm sure they weren't no howdy doody possessed toys either. These guys had limb mobility, expressive faces, dexterity, and motor skills. The murmurs I'm not sure about. It could have been a language or just groans. My memory is vague on that. They all sounded male to me, all very deep, not what you would expect from a small cute toy. While I read the story Puppet People, another story similar to mine's, I shouted at the screen, "No way, this can't be true. Those were dreams I had," in similar self-affirming statements, because that encounter echoed mine, and both seemed insane. I've thought about these toy-like creatures a lot ever since, teetering on obsession, really. I decided to look into the huntsman from the first time. There's no such thing as a colorful four-legged huntsman. I took to the internet in a quest for answers. After many bungled queries and ridiculous search results, I found the spider in question really does exist. According to the internet, the St. Andrew's cross spider is the Australian subspecies of a global genus of bizarre-looking spiders. The St. Andrew's cross spider is similar in appearance to a thin, wispy-legged huntsman with bright yellow and red marking. The St. Andrew's cross spider rests by placing its front and rear legs together, resulting in the appearance of a four-legged pose. X, like that. That's where it gets its name. That's how it looked on the wall. There was more info on a matching X design, which it builds into its circular web and rests upon as a matchmaking center pattern. Aw, little spider got flair. As a side note, the moment I clapped eyes on photos of this St. Andrew's cross spider, that night came flooding back in torrent of profound snapshots. It's been quite the momentous payoff finding this unique arachnid and staring at it again, all these years later. Now I credit autonomous toy puppet weirdos as more than an odd dream or two. Of all the entities, these guys fascinate me the most. Thanks for reading.
For as long as I've known, I have always had unexplained experiences, along with my mother, grandmother, and siblings. I'm starting to think this is a genetic trend, although I feel I have these occurrences more often than they do. I'm now at the age of 29. Most of these experiences happened when I was younger. I'm going to tell you one of an experience I had in this story when I think I may have visited hell. I remember this night very vividly. My parents were harshly arguing with one another, as usual. It died down after a while, but I still went to bed a little overwhelmed. I remember falling asleep like usual, like any other night, nothing different. From what I can explain, is to me, it felt as though my soul has lifted out of my body and drifted into another dimension. It felt like I was flying through the air bodiless and then promptly landed in what I thought to be a dimension of hell. I landed on high altitude light brown rock formation, and it seemed to be a very hot summer day. Everything seemed very physical and realistic. The sky looked normal, but as I looked around, there were no living creatures. Nothing was alive. There was no grass, no trees, nothing but this brown rock material for as far as I could see. I realized I had been placed in near the front of a line alongside with my mom against other people I had never even seen before, facing a little white chapel-like house that seemed to be the only thing in the entire dimension. The people in line looked like everyday ordinary people, except no one was making noise or moving a muscle. Everyone was very silent and still looking at the chapel-like house. I was very confused on what was happening. I began observing, but I never got out of line. I'm not sure why. It felt out of my control to do so. All of a sudden, I heard a very deep, scary demonic voice that muttered the words, "Go inside." I looked up to see where it came from, and there was a huge, transparent, dominant-looking face in the sky. I couldn't really make it out, or its features, or exactly what it was looking at. There was a few people in front of me who began walking slowly into the chapel-like house. They seemed terrified, but had no choice but to go in. A few people had to go in at a time, and the door slammed behind them. We were next in line. I turned to my mom, who was behind me, and whispered frantically because I didn't want the face to hear me, "Don't go in, it's not safe." She nodded in agreement with me, but seemed kind of zombie-like, as she didn't actually reply to me. As I looked at the chapel, there was a huge window in front that I could see in. What I saw was very disturbing and mentally unexplainable. It was very dark inside. The only thing I could see was 4 autopsy tables with 4 people on them as though they were dead, but not dead. I could only see from their feet up to their waist. It seemed like they were dead, but were able to move their feet. They looked like they were freshly dead. They didn't look like they had rotted or anything like that. Each of them seemed to have had a little ticket wrapped on each of their big toes, along with a white blanket covering them. I couldn't even see any further than that. It almost seemed like I was being forced to walk into a torture chamber. I was petrified and unable to move, and the door looked as if it was about to open again. All of a sudden, everything disappeared, and everything went to a fog. It seemed as if my soul traveled back to my body, and I could see myself sleeping. That itself was very chilling, and in a flash, I shot into my body and woke up all at once. I absolutely can't mark this off as just a dream, and I would love to hear any comments, feedback, or similar experiences anyone has had. The Baby Cemetery. In this story, I'm going to tell you one of my many real-life experiences. I was about 16 when this event occurred, and I'll never be able to explain how this happened or exactly what it was that I experienced. I remember falling asleep in my blue waterbed the night this occurred. That being said, let me begin. I woke up, but it wasn't my bed that I was in. It was someone else's. As I sat there confused, I also realized I wasn't in my own house either. The bed's sheets and comforter were white with purple flowers. The room was tan. There was a window to my right that was open, and the plain white curtains were blowing softly as the daylight came through. The bed was located in the left corner of the room, touching the wall. I just laid there, confused. I was still very tired, so I closed my eyes for a moment or two. When I opened my eyes, I was surrounded by 5 dead babies that were all facing me. They were very gray and rotted looking. They stared at me with very dark, soulless eyes. They had a cloth diaper and couldn't have been over the age of 1. I felt complete terror in that moment. I could not move a single muscle in my body or make any type of emotion. It felt like the dead infants were there for hours. Suddenly, they disappeared, and the day became night in the blink of an eye. I remember finally getting up out of the bed and walking through the house. I could feel the physicality of everything I did, and I was very observant. I remember feeling like the house was very sad and lonely, like I was there to help somehow. I walked outside of the house and looked at the front of it. I couldn't put it together in the dream, but it looked very familiar. Suddenly, I woke up again, but this time in my own bed and in my own house. The dream was still very vivid in my mind, and that's when I remembered why the house looked familiar. A few weeks earlier, I had dropped off my friend's 13-year-old brother's friend at his home, but I never went inside. The house was the exact house I had seen in my dream on the outside. This was something that I had to tell him about. The next day, he was at my friend's house, so I told him I had a dream that I was in his house. When I first told him this, he was laughing and denying it, until I started explaining his entire house in detail to him. I told him about the room I woke up in, everything that was in it, how many stairs he had on his staircase, and everything I had seen in exact detail. He looked completely shocked. He knew I had never been in his house before. He started crying and explained to me that his mom has been experiencing similar things. Apparently, it was his mom's room that I had woke up in. The backyard to their house had a very small yard, and then nothing but woods. He told me that he and his mom had walked deep into the woods once and found a children's cemetery from the late 1800s. and the graves were all for babies. Thanks for reading.
It's that thing again. Jeez.
So one day, my mom had made a bottle for my brother, and she checked it and everything. Then went to get my brother. When she came back to the kitchen, the bottle was gone. We checked everywhere, and we didn't find it. So my mom just gave up and made another one. She fed my brother and bathed him. Then we went to sleep. The next day, everyone woke up and got ready for church. When we got to the living room, the bottle that my mom had made was in the middle of the living room. I, being my dumb self, went to grab it. Just as I grabbed it, the bottle turned really hot and it burned my hand. My mom was scared, and my dad was trying to stay stable. When I screamed, I felt a pressure on my chest, and then my brother started babbling, then started crying really hard, and then my dog looked at me, then started barking extremely loud. Then I felt the pressure come off, and at the same time, my brother stopped crying, and my dog stopped barking. When that happened, I just fell to the ground and started crying. My mom was in shock, so my oldest sister ran to me and just held me there for like 10 minutes. Another one is that when my cousin was a baby, she would fall asleep in the living room, and when we would take her to her room, she would cry, looking up at the ceiling. My uncle told his coworker, and his coworker told him to take a picture wherever my cousin was looking. He did, and when he looked at the picture, it was a huge skeleton head, and it didn't stop there. They had so many things happen, but I'll tell those stories later. Thanks for reading. The Wood Street Years. This may be a little long and oddly written, as I had to write it all down quickly. It's not exactly a single story, but more of a collection of experiences from my old house that I wanted to discuss with you all to see what ideas and theories you all had. My family moved into the house in 1987. It was a 1950s council-owned property that they were renting. The village was an old place that housed a lot of miners that would go to and from the local coal pits, and also had mines under the most of the streets. It was an odd but lovely place, but there were always stories of hauntings throughout the village. It was as if the whole place was a hotbed of activity. Ever since the move to this new house, my family experienced odd things. My sister would complain of people sitting on the edge of her bed during the night. My father was followed by a hooded figure, even outside in the streets, and my mother had personal items vanish. Over the years, the activity became more and more intense. In 1995, my father moved out and went to live elsewhere, but we, my mother, sister, and brother, stayed in the house. My sister complained of activity in the house when we were out. Banging and scraping from the kitchen, items being shuffled, plates clattered. She got so scared at times that she would run into my mother's bedroom and sleep in there. The stairs and landing area always held some nasty element to it, and on the whole, the entire family hated it without any reason to. It was just something we all felt and never really voiced to each other until many years later. If we had to turn off the light in the hall, we'd run out and run back in. If we had to turn off the landing light at night, we'd do the same. We'd run out of the bedroom and quickly turn it off, only to hurl ourselves back into bed as fast as we could. And heaven forbid, we needed the toilet during the night. My sister eventually moved out and got married, and so did my brother. This left myself and my mother alone in the house.
My mother got a job after years of being unemployed, so I'd often be on my own from 5 a.m. to 12 p.m. It was then I began to really notice things. One morning, I had decided that instead of staying awake from 5 a.m., I would get some more rest. I settled back down into bed and closed my eyes. The next thing I knew, I heard a banging sound, followed by hurried footsteps coming up the stairs. The thing was, I knew it was our stairs, as they had a unique and distinct squeak to them. The top step would creak, and the next two steps up would make a lighter squeak, then a thud. It was definitely them. I thought Mom had come back, due to forgetting something, like keys or her purse even, but there was silence. We had a break-in a couple of years previous, so I was naturally on edge. It was actually my first thought, so I grabbed my phone and called my mother, who was almost at work, so it couldn't have been her. She also had assured me that she had locked the door, as normal. I was on the phone when I heard the exact same footsteps again. I've no idea how I did it, but I got back to sleep about a half an hour later. A couple of years passed where nothing much happened. Just the odd thing, like items vanishing and reappearing, noises from the attic, and odd smells. Then, we started noticing it again. My mother and myself went to the shops one day to pick up a snack from the local deli. When we returned, there was dripping coming from the ceiling just above the back door. We could hear whooshing from the pipes too. We bolted upstairs to find the bathroom taps fully on and the plug in. The bathroom was flooded. To this day, we have no idea what the hell happened there. This happened again about 2 years after, when we returned from an outing with my brother. This time, the plug was not in, thankfully. It was from that point it began to get more and more frequent. I would see things at night that I couldn't explain. I first put it down to lucid dreaming, but I was not the only one seeing them. I would see strange insect-like creatures crawling up the curtains and on the ceiling. I'd stare at them, and they would vanish after about 15 seconds. There was one time that I was not sleepy, and I was looking out the bedroom window at the street. It was about 1 a.m. at the time, and I saw something very strange on the hedge that surrounded the house. The only way to describe it was a spider, but it had ridiculously long legs, and it was gliding effortlessly across the top of the hedge. My fiance also saw this for himself back in 2009, and he sat there staring in amazement. And he's a skeptic too. Other things I would see were a man in my room. He would be halfway through the floor of the room. The stairs were directly under my room. Sometimes I would open my eyes and see a face looking back at me in close proximity, only to fade in a second or two. I admit that was very unwelcome. The last few years of living in the house had more physical things happen. Objects would be thrown across the room, things would stop working, or randomly activate by themselves. My laptop, which, by the way, does not do it anymore now. I live elsewhere, and we, my mother and myself, would have our covers pulled from us when in bed. I remember one night literally having to battle to keep the cover on me. There were also random and vile smells, almost like rotting meat, and an invasion of flies. Thankfully, this only happened once, and only lasted 3 weeks or so. We even checked for dead animals, but of course, we found nothing. Now keep reading because it gets a lot more freakier. My fiance moved in with me in the house not long before we moved out. He was the type that didn't believe in ghosts. He had been taught from an early age that when you die, that is it.
My mother began to date again and was out of the house frequently, leaving myself and my fiance alone. We decided to clean the house up a little, as we wanted to make my mother feel happier. She had been suffering from severe depression. I don't think it was approved of, as things kept going wrong. The vacuum would randomly overheat, even though in this new house it never has. Things would fall on us. Items would vanish. I even had the unit of our old computer literally fling out from under the desk and hit me square on my shin, even though there was no way it could have. I also had the vacuum cleaner itself chucked at me. We would also hear loud thumps from inside the wardrobe, as if someone was punching it from the inside. We'd joke and say, enough of that. Probably not the best of ideas, but we didn't intend to be scared by it, whatever it was. Another thing we noted was that when the door to my brother's old room, which had been used for storage over the previous few years, was left open, the toilet light would turn itself on. We would be out during the day, return at night, and it would be on. Or we'd wake up in the morning and it would be on. But it didn't happen when the door was shut. One day, I recall the door being left open, and I saw a stack of my drawings get lifted and flipped through right in front of my eyes. This was in the dead of winter, with no doors or windows open. Needless to say, I was not impressed and slept with the covers over my head that night. One night, my fiance was upstairs shaving while I was amusing myself playing a Facebook game. It was midnight, so naturally I was hungry. I always get hungry for some reason after midnight. So I went to the kitchen and started making myself a snack. I was addicted to omelet and cheese bagels at the time, so I started making one. After it had finished cooking, I took it into the living room and continued messing about on the game I was playing. I'd almost finished it when I heard Lee shout from on the landing. We had no bathroom light at the time, as the bulb had gone and we couldn't get the light cover off to replace it, so Lee was having to use a mirror on the landing. I went up to see what he wanted, and he said that he had seen a man in the mirror looking back at him. I was naturally confused, but my gut did flip-flops. I asked what kind of man, and he said it was a short, bald man. He even said that he stared at him and could see him out of the corner of his eye, looking over his shoulder, as if it was a real person present. Remember, my fiance is a skeptic. I admit, I was a touch unnerved. The door to my mother's room, which we had taken as our own by that point, was open a little way, and for some reason, I daren't look in. I also felt a little horrible cold feeling that felt as if it was wrapped around my ankles. I didn't want to stay up there at all. I went downstairs and called my mother up to see if there was anyone in the family who had died that fit the description. She said there was no one. So I tried to shrug it off immediately and finish the last bit of my bagel, only for my fiance to shout again. He came running down the stairs with foam still on his face, saying that he'd seen him again. Only this time, it was as if he was screaming at him, but he couldn't hear any sound. It had really freaked him out, and he was incredibly uncomfortable. I said for him to finish shaving quickly and calm down. Reluctantly, he went back up and tried to shave, but for some reason, the razor was not cutting anymore, no matter how hard he pressed. Also, the cold tap was chugging out scalding hot water, which burned his hand. During this time, I had gotten onto my mother again and told her he had seen this man again in the mirror. While I was on the phone, I could hear odd noises coming from upstairs. My fiance finished shaving and ran downstairs again, only to pause and stare into the kitchen with an absolutely horrified look on his face. I stopped talking to Mom to ask him what was wrong. He said that he had seen the man again outside the kitchen window, walking past with an unearthly grin on his face, and his was very skinny and looked like he had no arm on one side. I told him to get into the living room, and while I was still talking to my mother, I could hear loud footsteps coming from above me, my mother's old room. My bones were also cold, and the atmosphere was horrific. She suggested I get in touch with my brother so I could stay the night at his. But while she was talking, I felt the atmosphere lift suddenly. It was instantly warmer again, and I felt oddly happy. I actually mentioned it to her, as it was so sudden and drastic. But then, it dropped again. The feeling of dread and the cold returned, and it felt as if something was circling us. I got off the phone with her and called my brother. In a state of panic, I explained what was happening and the fact that we couldn't just stay in the house. We ended up at his place, sleeping in his living room. And now my fiancé is more open-minded about the paranormal. The house was never right from the start. I would love to know just what was going on there, but I guess I will never truly know. The day we moved out was interesting too. During the move, my mother had experienced a couple of little things while alone, i.e., a piece of paper scooting across the bedroom floor. But it was when the house was totally empty and the power had been turned off. Myself and my brother's missus went to check the rooms to be sure we hadn't left anything. All was well and clear. Then we got to my brother's old room. We opened the door and we were hit in the face by the most intense cold breeze. It was bone-chilling. It made our eyes water. We turned to each other, nodded, and said that it was fine and we should go. We legged it down the stairs, said goodbye to the house, and left to live in this new house we are in now. I am not asking for help. I just thought this would be an interesting story for all of us that have experienced things. I live in front of a mountain that is named Sims Mountain. The mountain can take you to various towns in West Virginia. I will tell of all the experiences I have experienced, or some of the ones I have heard, starting with the most famous, in my town. Well, an old tale that is common with the locals in my town is the Sims Mountain Ghost. The story takes place when West Virginia was still a part of Virginia. There was a widow living in a cabin with her 3 children. One day, the children went to pick berries in the woods. When the children did not return that evening, the woman went on a search. For days, the widow continued to search for her children. Well, one night she came home from searching and went to bed. That night, her cabin caught on fire and the woman was burned alive. Now, the locals say that in the evening, you can see the woman now in what are fields, or a huge group of fireflies going in the same direction. It is told that it is the spirit of the woman looking for her children. The story I'm about to tell you takes place 3 years before I was born. One evening, my brother, sister, mother, father, and grandmother took a ride around the mountain. When they saw a woman dressed in thin clothing and barefoot walking around, a few feet from where they had seen her, my father stopped and got out of the car to offer this woman a ride. She was nowhere to be seen, and there was nowhere to hide. He looked and said that there were no footprints in the light snow that had fallen early that day. He was spooked. My experience is very different. At the end of every summer break, I would have my friends come stay, and my father would take us on a night truck ride. We would always leave when we could still see a little. We were in the bed of the truck and joking around when we all got a cold chill. We had looked to see that there were a group of fireflies in the fields. We just laughed and said it was here to snatch one of our new friends who had come along. When we looked again, the fireflies were gone and nothing was there. Later on that night, we had seen another spirit on our way home. We had just passed some woods when a bright light with a dark figure had appeared in the place we had just driven over. It scared us and it followed us until we got off the mountain. My brother and his friend were up four-wheeling one afternoon when they stopped in front of an old cabin that had been there for years. There were no ceilings for floors on the second floor because they had been in there before. My brother's best friend started to head down the path first. While my brother was making sure everything was all right with our ATV, his friend had ran back, jumped on the back, and said, "Leave now." My brother was shocked. After all, his friend had never been scared by anything. He had asked him what was wrong. His friend just said that he had seen a young pregnant woman looking from the top window. He had told my brother she looked angry and was just yelling, but he could not hear what she had said. Then he had seen that her finger was moving, as if she was telling him to come into the cabin. My brother went and saw the same thing. He had run back to the ATV where his friend stayed. He jumped on, and they were gone. He has taken many people back to the cabin, including me. None of us had ever seen her. We had just got an eerie feeling. The funny thing is that my brother's friend has never returned back to the cabin. We all now believe that he triggered the spirit. All I can say now is that this mountain has many lost souls, I believe, and they all just have unfinished business. It seems to me that they died before their time and will continue to stay there until they have found their peace. Strange sights and sounds. Living by the coast, I grew up spending a lot of time on the beach. Summers and holidays zipped by with hours of swimming. One particular Sunday in May, I decided to stay in the sun the entire day, and that earned me a pretty nasty sunburn. Swimming and moving out of the house for the following week was forbidden. Much to my grief, I was under house arrest. The next day, my parents decided to spend the evening by the pool along with some of their friends and took my brother along. I was 13 and my mom thought I was old enough to stay on my own for a few hours. She promised to be back by sunset. I was okay being alone in the house as long as there was daylight. The big sprawling house would turn into a nightmare once dusk turned into night. There was a huge neem tree just outside the kitchen. For some reason, it would instill fear in me. I switched on every possible light downstairs and waited over anxiously for my parents to return home. I walked to the kitchen to get a drink of water. It was a sultry summer night, not a hint of breeze. I heard the neem tree shaking violently. I left my drink on the counter and rushed outside. My next door neighbors were out as well, and the street I lived on was empty. Chanting prayers in my head, I walked gingerly to the streetlight. I slowly turned towards the incinerator. Earlier in the evening, I put out every single mark there was by chucking fistfuls of sand into the grid. A few seconds after staring at the incinerator, it suddenly was alight. The flames danced 4 feet high. Now, I was really scared. It was close to 8 o'clock. The fire had been put out at 5:30. I stared in disbelief at the fire, watching the flames grow higher and shrink and then grow higher again. I thought the garage wall would turn black by the way the fire kissed the walls. As mysteriously as the fire was started, it disappeared. There was no trace of it. I convinced myself it was my imagination. The prayers did not seem to be working. I tried distracting my mind. I was hoping for some summer breeze, but the night was as still as a church mouse. My eyes stared ahead of me at the entrance of the sprawling mansion I hated. My heart was pounding painfully against my ribcage. My mind was racing faster than a locomotive. I heard the rustling of leaves, as though branches were being shaken rather violently. The night was still not showing any signs of any wisps of wind. I, very reluctantly, turned my head towards the neem tree. The tree was still, but I could still hear the leaves rustling. I turned my head upwards, and I saw a small, shadowy figure on the top of the tree, shaking the tree with all its might. The shadow turned my way. By this time, I was so frightened, I didn't know whether I wanted to stay rooted to the spot or run away. My heart felt like it would explode. I had goosebumps all over my body. A chill ran down my spine. At the top of the road, heading towards me, was a pair of headlights. I was going to flag the vehicle down and make whoever was in it get out and wait with me until my parents returned home. The vehicle stopped in front of me. To my utmost relief, it was my father's Jeep that had halted. My mother was shocked to see me standing on the road. She walked over to me and noticed I was trembling. I told her what had happened. She was aware of my experiences from the past, and she was sympathetic. The next morning, I rushed to the incinerator to inspect it inch by inch. Equipped with my trusty magnifying glass, I studied the entire grid diligently. There were no marks on the wall. The garbage had been turned to ashes. I spoke to my parents' maids when they came to work. They told me that all the neem trees are owned by jinns. I pestered my dad to cut the neem tree down, and finally he agreed after much debating, haggling, and cajoling. That was the end of that experience and the jinn. I still don't know for sure what was out there that night, and I probably will never find out. Union Cemetery spirits hang out by tree. This uncomfortable feeling took place in the fall of 2004 when me and a friend took a ride up Route 59 on Sunday afternoon to the intersection of 59 and 136, arriving at the historical Union Cemetery. Now, usually I go to these historical burial grounds in Connecticut to look at the gravestones and absorb all the rich history the state has to offer. But this time, we just went there to see if we could get a thrill being near the Halloween season. Nothing was happening, no ill feelings, no sense of discomfort while walking around the grounds. If you have or have not been there, there is a small dirt parking area just in front of the main gate on Route 136 to the corner of Route 59. You can walk straight into the property and go left towards Route 59 or right towards the church. Straight and to the left, in the distal part of the property, there are a few trees set along the back edge of the property near the creek that runs along the back to or from behind the small church that is also located within the gated area. One tree in particular, that is quite large, I'd say, is surrounded by a few scattered headstones. As I looked over in that direction, it looked like a nice place to explore. I commented to my friend, "That's where I would hang out." We soon walked into the area and proceeded to walk around the tree. It was shaded with headstones placed strategically around the tree. I don't remember if it was an oak tree or maple. It's the largest tree in the cemetery. After about a minute, we were both bombarded with overwhelming sadness and anxiety that we left immediately and fled for the car. Because we both felt strange, we believed on that day there was a lot of activity in the Union Cemetery. The Legless Man in the Cemetery. I came across this website recently, and I figured this could be a good place to tell about my experiences, which I had around 10 years ago. The majority of my family lives in northwestern Minnesota, and I lived in Minneapolis at the time with my immediate family. We would go visit my family up north a couple times each summer and do things like hunting, fishing, going off-roading with ATVs, etc. Oftentimes, me and my cousin would go off-roading on our ATVs in an area west of a town called Thief River Falls. It's mostly farmland, some forest plots, highways, a few farms, and houses along with some gravel roads. One summer evening around 7 p.m., I was out with my cousin on our ATVs, and the radio which we had on as ATV was set to the NOAA weather radio station, which was saying that a severe thunderstorm warning was issued for Pennington County, the county in which we were in, and it was scheduled to arrive in about an hour. Since he lived about 10 miles south of where we currently were at that point, we decided to start making our way back before the storm hit. About 5 minutes later, we decided to stop right by an old cemetery, in church situated about 50 yards ahead of us, on the right side of the road, to look at the giant cumulonimbus cloud that was quickly moving towards us. By this point, the sky started to get a little dark, and we could hear the thunder starting to rumble, but we figured we had enough time to kill before the storm arrived. A couple moments after we stopped, I started getting this strange feeling. The best way to describe it was that it was like someone was watching us. In fact, I even checked all around me out of instinct, but there was no one there except for us two, of course. I then heard my cousin fire up his ATV and telling me that we should get going. I started up my ATV and proceeded to follow him, but I still had this strange feeling that I was being watched. As we got closer to the cemetery, I started to slow down because that feeling I was having was getting stronger and stronger. As I passed the cemetery gate, I see a man in his 50s or 60s wearing a white short sleeve button-up shirt and a pair of black slacks standing next to a grave looking south, which is the same direction we were headed. However, I quickly noticed that his legs were missing from his knees downward. I immediately hit the brakes as I could not believe what I was seeing. He then turned his head to look at me, and I will never forget that scornful look he had on his face as he stared at me for those few seconds. As he stared at me, I started getting this cold, clammy feeling that one usually gets when scared. After a few seconds, he starts to slowly float towards me, at which point I gunned it and got out of there as quickly as I could. When I checked my rearview mirrors, I didn't see anyone or anything behind me, but I wasn't going to wait around to find out. My cousin noticed I had stopped and was waiting for me about a quarter of a mile up the road from where I had stopped. I lied to him that I had just seen a couple of deer run across the cemetery and was just watching them frolic about. That night, I couldn't sleep because I kept thinking about that legless man. From that point on, whenever I visited, I always made sure to never go by that cemetery again, because I'm honest to God afraid that he will follow me home if I go by there again. Cemetery Rescue. I had some interesting paranormal experiences growing up in the Las Vegas area. One is kind of funny, and while it may or may not have a paranormal component, I thought it would be a good one to share. When I was 18 in the early 80s, a friend and I had been spending the evening downtown. That meant the Fremont State area in the early 80s. Walked around, ate some 50-cent shrimp cocktails, played a bit of 21 at the Horseshoe, where it was easier to get away with underage gambling at the time. We'd pretty much had our fill, so we decided for some unknown reason to stop by a cemetery, since it was 1 a.m. and likely to be creepy, and we were basically kids doing what kids do. We pulled into an empty and dark parking lot, and I turned off the car engine. We got out and stood by the car. It was a cemetery off of Main Street, I think, and totally quiet. There was no traffic on the road adjacent, and not a soul to be seen. As a matter of fact, it was eerily quiet. We stood there maybe 20 seconds, and both decided we wanted to leave. Now, we jumped back in the car, and I tried to start it, but it wouldn't start. This hadn't happened before. I kept trying, and it wouldn't start, and I think I flooded the engine. So here we were, stuck in a dark cemetery with nothing around. Back then, nothing was nearby. I was just starting to see how much trouble we were in when all of a sudden, there was a car next to us. A cop car. It wasn't the typical LVPD car, but something that looked like it belonged in a small town off the highway with tumbleweeds blowing around. I didn't even notice it pull up. The cop, who looked more like a sheriff, walked to my door and asked if we needed a ride. We eagerly took him up on his offer. He drove us to my friend's house on 8th Street, and as he turned the corner of the street, he turned us around to us in the back seat, smiled devilishly, and said, "Watch this. Your neighbors are going to love it." And he proceeded to turn on his flashing lights and briefly hit his sirens. By that time, it's about 2 in the morning. The turkey, he laughed, then laughed again as we tried to open the door from the back seat. Finally, he let us out. We thanked him and ran inside. His lights were still flashing in the driveway of the house. I went back for the car the next day, and it started up on the first try. Why did this cop show up right then and appear out of nowhere? Why were his uniform and car so old-fashioned looking? Was he for real, or was he somehow sent to save us? And last, why the heck did my car pick that moment in time to stop working? I'll never know, but I'm thankful to this day for the rescue. Living in Vernon was very hard on my family. My dad decided he was tired of being a parent and gave my mom 2 years to get a job and get out of the house, unbeknownst to me and my youngest sister, of course. My brother left the house as soon as he turned 18, and he was always getting drunk or high, or having relations with certain seedy women. My older sister was caught up in her own drama and had no kind words to offer her younger siblings. So I suppose it's no surprise that my little sister and I had paranormal experiences there. First, allow me to explain the layout of the Vernon house. The front door opened to a small foyer, then the dining room and kitchen, which are connected. The hallway to our bedrooms was to the left, while the kitchen was to the right. Standing in the foyer, you could almost see the entire house, including the huge family room down a couple of stairs connected to the dining room. Now, before I begin, I'd like to explain that I had a problem with sleepwalking as a child. I would go to sleep in my bedroom, then wake up in the living room, kitchen, etc. Sometimes, I even interacted with everyone who was still awake while I was in these states. My first encounter with the entity seemed like just another horrible nightmare. In the dream, I walked down the hallway from my bedroom into the living room. I was wearing the exact pajamas I had gone to sleep in, and the house was exactly the same as we'd left it at bedtime. For one reason or another, I felt the urge to look into the kitchen. There he was. The static man appeared in the doorway between the dining room and kitchen. He was tall, barely touching the ceiling, and he appeared robed in black. Instead of a head upon his shoulders, there was this great ball of static. The sound buzzed constantly. I stood there, frozen with fear, staring up at the static man. After perhaps a couple seconds, he reached out his long, dark arm towards me. Then he seemed to kind of float, closer and closer. The buzzing got so loud that it hurt my ears. I remember closing my eyes, screams stuck in my throat, and then I woke up on the couch in the dining room, facing the kitchen. I told my parents about the dream, but they weren't overly concerned about it. No, for a while, I just brushed off the dream. But I wasn't the only one affected by the static man. Apparently, my little sister, Catherine, was woken up one night. When she opened her eyes, the static man was standing between our beds. He seemed to be looking at her. Catherine, despite her fear, got angry with the man. "Get out of here! God will be angry if you don't leave us alone." Then, in a flash of bright light, the static man was gone. Catherine settled herself back into bed and slept peacefully the rest of the night. It should be mentioned that Kat would hear and see things in the Vernon house. Shadows would play in her peripheral vision, and voices would call our names. One time, when we were playing in the backyard, she looked into the alley behind our gate and saw these kids standing a ways away. They called to her, promising her a good time. She ran into the house and didn't tell me why until years later. For many years after Kat's bravery, I didn't have any encounters with the static man. My mom moved us to Wichita Falls, where she finished her degree in nursing. Dad moved to Albin. We started going to a Catholic school. My sleepwalking stopped completely, and for the first time in years, I was able to sleep peacefully. Everything, for a while, seemed great. A couple years later, we moved in with my dad. My mom was trying to save their marriage. A few months after settling into the house, the static man appeared again. I woke up in a cold sweat. The man was standing beside my bed, leaning over me. All of a sudden, I was tossed a few inches straight up from the surface of my bed. I would later try to recreate this movement on my own. I couldn't get off the surface of the bed from my position. Then, something pinned me down by my arms and legs. I felt hands wrap around my neck and start choking me. Trying to fight off this attack, I desperately looked around, hoping Kat had been awoken. She hadn't, of course, but I did notice that where I felt fingers grabbing my limbs, there were deep depressions in my flesh. After perhaps a minute or so, I was released, and the static man disappeared as quickly as he'd come. For the rest of the night, I lay there, wide awake, shaking and gasping. From then on, every night, for about a year, I was disturbed in the same way. I was completely drained of energy. My grades fell abruptly, and I violently lashed out at my family. For instance, I actually tried to suffocate my little sister with a pillow. Then I started biting, hitting, and cutting myself just to feel something. I'd even tried to kill myself. My mom, sister, and I moved into our current apartment after 2 years of darkness in my dad's home. The static man continued to torment me. I tried to talk to my mom about it, but she kept telling me that it was just a dream and that it was a side effect of my new antidepressant. If there was something wrong in this house, I'd know about it. I have experiences with these things. Remember? She said things like this, even when I kept with her, and the entire bed shook as the man attacked. Caroline, if you keep shaking the bed, I'm kicking you back to your room. One night, I just laid in my bed crying, waiting for the static man to appear. I pleaded to God for just one night of peace. Please, God, please, God, please. I was shaking from fear and exhaustion. I suddenly felt a wave of peace wash over me. I stopped crying and closed my eyes. When the static man jolted me out of bed, I wasn't afraid. It didn't touch me, didn't buzz. It was the first night in a long time I was able to get a good sleep. Thank you, Jesus, I remember thinking before I drifted off to sleep. Ever since then, the static man has only visited me once every few weeks. I'm not afraid of going to bed anymore, and he hasn't been able to touch me lately. I believe either his power is weakening or I'm getting stronger, somehow. Although, I know I'll probably never be rid of this entity. I know he won't be able to hurt me like he was able to beforehand. As to what exactly the static man is, I have no idea. I don't believe he's a human spirit, and he most certainly doesn't resemble any of the nature spirits I've encountered. I don't believe he's a manifestation caused by my medication or even stress, as he appears despite what's going on in my life, and despite whether or not I take my meds. I've tried, and continue to try, to research our old house, but all attempts have proved fruitless. I do know that 2 boys, one of whom lived in the house after we moved, committed suicide for mysterious reasons. Perhaps they're connected, perhaps not. I don't think I'll ever know. Whatever the static man is, I'll continue to fight him, be it through meditation and prayer, or other means if things escalate again. Thank you for reading my incredibly long story. Comments, suggestions are all welcome, as usual. Final goodbye, verse, static in the air. Users, my story takes place in church. It was my grandmother's funeral, and we were all in our Orthodox church, grieving while the ceremony took place, as you do. Now, my grandfather had passed a year before this. I remember being in tears as the priest spoke about her life and how she is now much happier. As I stared into nothing while looking down at her coffin, it's like my brain had tapped into the world of the supernatural. There he was, my grandfather, standing with one hand on her coffin, looking down at her. I don't know for sure that it was him, because I couldn't see ahead. My abilities are obviously not strong enough.
but I just knew it was him. I felt safe and happy. After this experience, we had driven down to the cemetery to say our final goodbyes. As we lowered the coffin into the ground, the sun came out and shone on our coffin. When we could no longer see the coffin, the sun was gone. I was extremely happy. I knew it was my grandparents saying goodbye for the last time. Ever since I had tapped into the supernatural realm of the world, if I concentrate hard enough, I can see what appears to be static in the air. What is this? Am I looking into it too much? Or is this a common thing first-timers see? I often feel eyes on me in my own house, and am scared to be home alone. I hear footsteps and jingling like change, and I know it probably shouldn't scare me, but it does. Can somebody help me understand the static in the air and explain to me a way I can deal with these felt presences? If you had read my story and or commented below, thank you so much for your time. I look forward to help and advice from other users. The White Wings. As this is my first time at publishing a story here, I thought I should start relatively slowly and also explain some background about me. Up until recently, I've been a dancer my entire life and have always felt most serene stood in the wings of a stage. Funny, really, that this story so revolves around wings in every sense. Being a performer, countless hours have been spent on a stage and backstage, wings, tech booths, dressing rooms, etc. Now, though most of my experiences have been personal, I thought I would start with one that was only about me and not something I actually saw myself. It happened during a dress rehearsal for an annual show that I was about to perform in about 2 years ago. I was in a local theater where I am from in South Wales. To set the scene, I was stood alone in the right-hand side wings of the stage. For non-stagey folks, this just means the small space on either side of the theater stage, where you are concealed from the audience. On the opposite side to me were my teacher and her close friend, who acted as our stage manager. It is important to note that both of these women are very spiritual, and I believe quite in tune with the unexplainable. There is usually very minimal light when you are in the stage area, as was the case now. I was waiting to rehearse a routine and was also acting as an assistant teacher at the time, so was spending 90% of that dress rehearsal right where I was when this event apparently occurred. There were plenty of other people in the auditorium, but none where I was standing at this time. I must stress, there was nothing but black walls and a few tables behind me, and I was very much alone when our stage manager witnessed this event. She claimed to have been watching me from across the stage as we waited to progress, when she saw a large pair of white wings appear behind me, almost wrapping around me. Angel wings? Butterfly wings? What? I was told this all by my teacher shortly afterwards, a woman whom I was very close with and trust immensely. The stage manager had apparently asked my teacher about me as she was seeing it. Has she lost someone close to her recently? My teacher confirmed that, in fact, I had, and the manager proceeded to explain why she was asking. I have always felt a strong feeling with me backstage since this person passed, and always hoped they were there to watch me, as they always had done. One more mentionable detail would be that a while later that day, while the show was in full swing, the same stage manager said I had walked past her in the wings to go backstage, and a huge gust of wind seemed to sweep after me. This stage has no natural drafts, no windows, doors, etc., that could produce winds, and it is always boiling when you're up there. You'd be grateful for a breeze. So again, strange. I have always wondered about this event and hope that it means my loved one was with me. If anyone could confirm this or explain about any theories of seeing wings, I would be so grateful. Thank you so much for reading. At the end of the hall. Anyone who works in the medical field knows the wise tales, such as opening windows when a patient passes, or they come in threes. Given my background with my house, I tend to shrug things off my shoulders and ignore little incidents, telling myself I'm seeing things. On this particular night at work, it was just two aides, one med tech, and myself, the nurse, on the back halls. Now, you would think that the newly built wing would not have any ghosts contained in that area, but we were proven wrong. Around 1930, I was beginning my med pass. As I went to each door, I made sure to keep my card against the wall, so everyone can get through and to see out of my peripherals if anyone needed me. I go into 228 with their medicine, come out, throw away my gloves, and prepare to start pulling meds to the next patient. When I see someone standing in the doorway at the end of the hall, I pause, turn to see if someone needed my help. But no one was there. I continued to pass my medicine, coming out each room, closing the doors behind me. Again, out of the corner of my eye, I see someone standing at the end of the hall, in a doorway. I turn to check, and no one was there. At this time, I only had 3 more rooms left. Inching my way closer to the spot, I kept seeing something. When I get to the last room, I go in, do my routine, come out to my cart, and notice the room I was just previously in. Door is open. Now, knowing the history of the patient and knowing I was the only person down the hall, it kind of took me by surprise. But I didn't react. I just simply closed the door. I go to my last room, and again, when I come out, the same door is open. And can you guess which room it was? The exact room I kept seeing someone stand at the end of the hall. So I played nice, left it be, and started wheeling back towards the nurse's station to start my charting. It's about 12:30 now, and all the rooms are asleep. Lights turned off in the halls. My teammates sitting in the living space, so I guess you can say it's pretty quiet, which every nurse never wants the word uttered on their shift. Now, where I sit at the station, I can see down 2A and courtyard, which is relatively new. I'm almost finished with my charting when I started hearing footsteps coming from the courtyard. So I quickly glance over to see if my patients are walking the halls. And nope, sure wasn't. I go back to charting when again I hear footsteps, but this time was a little bit more noise with it. We have a few patients who like to wander into other rooms, so I get up, let my workers know what I'm doing if they need me, and headed up the hall. Stopping outside each room, I patiently wait, listening, and then take a few steps to the next, and so on. I inch further towards the end of the hall, to the room I kept seeing someone stand in the doorway. Of course, I'm thinking, awesome, just my luck, as I start raising my arm to turn the light switch, a loud crash came from within the room. I hoofed it down the hall, not looking back. My coworkers looked at me, bug-eyed and saying, "What the f?" As I'm gasping for air, I'm trying to explain what just happened, and of course, they don't want to go check the room. So, we all go, and to our surprise, whole room was cleaned. Nothing on the floor, nothing misplaced, no one and nothing. Want to know the creepy part? A patient had been staying in that exact room for about 2 months and finally was okay to go home a few days prior. That morning of my shift change, we got a phone call saying the patient who used to be in there had fallen in the early AM and had passed away due to severe hemorrhage of the brain. What the heck did I just see under my bed? When I was 13 years old, I had an experience that I can't explain, which gave me a horrible scare. Shortly after my grandpa passed away, I lay awake in bed one summer night, thinking of him, as I listened to my sister snoring across from me. My dad had left for work and my mother was in her room with the door closed, wearing her usual set of earplugs so as not to hear our nightly chatter. As I lay there with my covers up around my chest, I could hear the traffic outside and people making all kinds of noises. Suddenly, my covers were yanked all the way down to my ankles. My first reaction was to just lay there and not move. I didn't know what to do. I remember feeling my heart throbbing inside my chest so loud that I thought I would awake my sister. Unfortunately, I had no such luck. After a few minutes of lying so still and not moving, I decided to try and pull my covers back up to where they had been. Slowly, I reached down, barely moving, and with both hands gave a yank, but to my surprise, the covers were stuck as if something had a firm hold on them. The covers didn't even budge an inch. Oh my God, I thought to myself, what is under my bed? I tried 2 more tugs on my covers with no luck. At this point, I was so scared that I couldn't even speak. I was trying to yell, "Help!" but nothing came out. What am I going to do? I wondered. I thought maybe I could jump off my bed and make a dash for the light switch, but I imagined this hideous creature under my bed reaching out and grabbing my ankles as I sprang for the lights. At this point, the thought was just too much to comprehend. I was literally paralyzed by fear. By now, I was soaking wet from nervous perspiration and shaking inside from fear. I thought of all the bad things I might have done to make me deserve this night of terror. I decided to give it one more shot. Just give a big yank with all my strength, maybe the covers would come loose. So with a last-ditch effort, I gave a big yank. To my surprise, the covers came flying up over my head, as if they had never been stuck at all. At this point, I wasn't going to waste any time. I tucked those covers underneath my legs, covered my head, and held the excess covers in my hand. Nothing was going to get me now. I was safe under the covers. Shortly after hyperventilating, I fell asleep. Unfortunately, my night did not end here. I began to dream. I was in my room again, in my bed, but this time, my sister was awake. She was standing next to my bed brushing her hair at our vanity. "Will you please reach under my bed and get Tilly, my ragdoll, for me?" You see, I had this great plan that whatever was under my bed was still there. However, my sister was going to see it, not me. As my sister bent down to reach under my bed, she let out this terrible scream and backed away from my bed. I was startled by this reaction, and without thinking, I flung my legs off the bed to run away. As I did this, A golden clawed hand came out from under my bed and grabbed my ankle. The next thing I knew, it was morning, and it was all over. I ran out of my room, happy to be alive, but when I told my parents what had happened, they just blamed it on a overactive imagination. I was upset because I knew it happened. I don't know what it was that was under my bed that night, but to this day, I still worry about it coming back for me. The hand under the bed. Growing up, I was always a chicken when it came to scary stories. My family and I attended church, but back then, as my sisters and I were younger, we were not as spiritual as we are now. The first experience I had was probably when I was in 5th grade. It was a long time ago. I remember it was a Sunday evening when my oldest sister's boyfriend came over. After watching a movie, my siblings and I all gathered together with my oldest sister and her boyfriend as he told us many ghost stories. As the stories got deeper and scarier, I began to cry because I was too scared. That following Monday, my 2 oldest sisters, me, and my younger brother got up to get ready to go to school. I had 2 younger sisters who weren't in school yet. In our house that we were currently living in, our bedrooms were all upstairs in the 2nd floor, while the kitchen and living room was downstairs. Right before my oldest sister was going to head out for school, she'd asked me to go upstairs to her room to go grab her jacket that she had forgotten. Without hesitating, I did as I was told. My sister's room was very well organized, since she was the only one out of all our siblings to have her own room. Her twin-size bed was centered in the middle of the room against a wall, and her bed sheets were nicely fixed. As I began to look around for her jacket, which was hung onto the back of her chair, that's when I saw it. I saw an arm, just from elbow down, to the hand slip out from under her bed. The hand did a half a circle slide on the ground as it went back under the bed. At the moment, I thought it was my 2 youngest sisters who might have woke up early and decided to play in my older sister's room. I walked around the bed to the other side, bent down, and lifted up the bed sheets to discover nobody under the bed. At that instant, I felt shivers throughout my body as the hair from my back of my head raised. Unbelievable. I ran crying out of her room, back downstairs to tell the rest of my siblings what had just happened. Until this day, I can still remember the image of the hand sliding out from under the bed. It might have just been a quick 5-second, but those 5 seconds still scare me until this day when I think about it. I don't know what might have triggered me to see that arm, but I tend to tell myself that it was just my imagination playing with me because of all the ghost stories I heard the night before. But I know for a fact that this really happened and not my imagination. Has anything like this ever happened to anyone before? It's seriously confusing and obviously frightening me. Thanks for reading. There's a monster under the bed. This event happened years ago, and I was probably around the ages between 10 until 13. But I assure you, what I experienced as a kid was pretty horrifying. During this time, I had a pet cat which would walk around the house at night. But it would be known it was the cat because she had a bell around her neck that made a jingle noise every time she moved. So, as I prepared my bed, which was a sofa that converted into a bed, I proceeded to turn off all the lights and the television and lie down. After a long while of trying to sleep, I hear this heavy breathing noise that seemed to originate from under my bed.
I thought to myself that it was probably my imagination, or that I was probably breathing so heavy that I could hear myself. With that thought in mind, I then decided to hold my breath and stop breathing to see if it was me. To my surprise, I still heard the breathing just as heavy as ever. As the breathing was still going on, I then thought it could have been probably the cat. Regardless though, I was frozen in fear and did not dare to move, and I was thinking of grabbing the television remote control to turn it on, although I don't actually remember if I did or not. So, as I was wondering if it was the cat or not, I then heard the cat's bell jingle 2 rooms down out of my room. This just freaked me out even more. Since this happened so long ago, I don't actually remember how I spent the rest of the night. Anybody have any ideas of what it could have been? I just remember the next morning when I checked under the bed and the couch. I found nothing. What's under my bed? We lived in a little trailer court in Bigler, Pennsylvania. I was about 5 years old when myself and my sister started experiencing unexplainable things. There were always a lot of strange things happening. We would see and hear things. There was one occasion when someone or something said my sister's name and laughed in our closet. Every night we would hear what sounded like boots walking back and forth through the trailer. But the thing that really scared me the most is the night me and my sister looked out the window and saw a black thing standing there. As quickly as it appeared, it was gone. Every night, I would get ready to go to sleep. My bed would start shaking very slowly. Then after a while, it would shake faster. The first time it ever happened to me, I ran out of my room and told my parents. They said it was just a washer and dryer. But the thing I didn't even get was, even when the washer and dryer were not on, my bed would still shake. Eventually, I started to sleep on the couch, but the same thing started to happen, which resulted in me sleeping on the floor beside my bed. I slept on the floor for over 2 years. I never slept on my bed until we moved out. The house we moved into was a newly built house. Even though we moved, I still did not sleep on my bed. That was until a few months ago. Still, today, nobody believes me, but I know what happened. After these experiences, I started to get into the supernatural even more tremendously than I did before. If you got any comments for me, please leave some. Ghost under my bed. I woke up one night because I felt someone pulling my leg. At first I wasn't sure if I was just dreaming, so I ignored it. I was about to close my eyes when I felt a hand pull my leg again. I yelled and ran to my parents' room. My parents wouldn't believe me and would tell me to go back to sleep. I was only 10 years old at the time. Soon, I began to hear voices whispering to me at night. I also started hearing the voices during the day sometimes. One time, I was getting ready to go to sleep, and through the corner of my eye, I could have sworn I saw someone peeking their head out from underneath my bed. When I told my parents about this, they decided that it was best if I started sleeping with my brother. But this didn't solve the problem. No matter if I was staying at my grandma's house or my aunt, the same thing would happen to me at night to where someone would pull my feet. This went on for years. I'm 23 now, and it still happens. Of course, not as much as it used to. Back then, it would happen every night, but now several days can go by and nothing happens, but then suddenly, it comes back. I've also noticed that if I sleep with the lights on, it goes away. I'll still hear the voices,
but the only difference is that it sounds like it's coming from really far away. I don't get my feet pulled with the lights on. I've gotten used to it, and I'm no longer scared. But is this something I'm going to have to live with for the rest of my life? To be honest, I'm actually curious and want to know if this has happened to anyone else. The ghost that puts stuff under the bed. This has happened to me a couple of times. My mom had a pink bracelet that had some very pretty glass beads. My sister took it and pulled it. The string snapped and the beads flew everywhere. My dad looked all over the floor. As my mom counted the beads, she was missing one. My dad and I checked under and around the bed. About 20 minutes later, my dad walked into the kitchen and said that he found the bead under the bed, balanced on its side. About a week later, my brother's game case went missing. My dad checked under the bed. Later, he checked again. It was under the same bed, in the same place, and same room as the bead. That happened to the gaming case twice. Then, my mom's hairbrush went missing for a month. It was in the same place as the gaming case and the bead. Why our ghost likes to take our stuff and put it under the bed, I will never know. I've noticed that it has not taken any of my stuff and put it under the bed. It's still a frightening experience. I know it's not as scary as other experiences people have had on this board, but I just wanted to let you guys know. Truly something under my bed. So I vividly remember when I was about 10 to 12 years old, paranormal activity happening to me right before I would go to sleep at night. This did not happen just once, but at least 3 or 4 times that I can remember between these ages. It would all start out right after I had finished reading and had turned off my lamp on my end table. My family is very Christian, and my dad had me read the Bible before bed every night. Anyway, I remember resting my head on my pillow once when I would feel something like a fist push up on the mattress beneath me. I was not sleeping, and I was not just imagining it. I would physically sit up, turn my lamp on, and watch my bed move up and down on that spot. Like I said before, this did not just happen to me once, but several times when I was young. My parents lived on the opposite side of the house, and there was no one that could easily fit under my bed. I was always too scared to try and jump off and run, or even just to look underneath and see what it was for fear that it would get me. After about 1 minute of it starting, it would stop and not come back for at least a few nights. I never did tell my parents about it, even though it would keep me up late at night, some nights sleep deprived. I think it's just because it would happen so fast, and when I woke up in the morning, I wouldn't be thinking about it until it was the next night already. The years following this, I think I still have an irrational fear to sit on my bed with my feet on the ground and feel really uncomfortable when I do. I also still have not been able to explain why this happened to me during that age, but I definitely remember every bit of it truly happening. India is a country having numerous forts. Many of them have been in existence for a while now and have played a very important role in shaping the history of the country. This incident happened in the early 90s when I was in college. It was December and exams were just over. We had a couple of weeks to go before the start of the new term. 4 of us, namely I, Peru, Nikhil, and Canoe, decided to go for an overnight trek to one of the old deserted forts to unwind, relax, and enjoy nature in general. We had heard some stories of the fort being haunted, but nevertheless decided to carry on just for the experience. This fort is situated around 150 kilometers from Mumbai and is around 1,400 meters above sea level. It is a 6-hour trek to the fort. We started at around 7 a.m. in the morning and were fully geared up to spend the night on the fort. Nikhil had brought a gas stove and other food items required for cooking. We had even planned a barbecue later that night. The weather was very pleasant, and the cool breeze really refreshed us and made the trek less tiring. We reached the gates of the fort at around 1 p.m. in the afternoon. There were a couple of other trekkers like us on the fort. They were very friendly, and we soon began chatting. They told us that they had trekked to the fort a couple of times before, but always left before sundown. When we told them of our plans to stay there overnight, they looked concerned and told us about reports of spirits and hauntings, which were reported earlier. When they found that we were determined to spend the night there, one of them insisted that we stay at the temple located at the entrance of the fort, which was considered safe by locals. The scenery from the fort was breathtaking, and Peru, along with Nico, had a great time photographing nature at its best. After a great lunch, we rested for some time and began looking around. The fort was huge, with a lot of items of historical significance. We also located a pond, which would fulfill our requirements for water, required for drinking and cooking. It was 6 p.m. and the sun had nearly set. Our trekker friends had left an hour back, wishing us the best of luck. We had already kept our stuff near the temple, where we could cook and spend the night after dinner. My friends suddenly had this crazy idea of going to the pond and enjoying a nice swim. Though I am a good swimmer, I was apprehensive since it was getting dark and the waters were unknown. The element of risk involved prevented me from joining them, and I sat outside, enviously watching them splashing around. This is when something strange happened. Canoe felt something grasp his leg and pull him into the water. He immediately shrugged himself free and looked a bit shaken. Though concerned, we tried to convince him that his foot might have gotten entangled in the weeds in the water. I asked everyone to come out immediately so that we could head back and start preparations for dinner. While walking towards our camp, Canoe told us that he was suddenly feeling very cold and started shivering. All of us were surprised to see this since Canoe is a robust guy who seldom falls ill. We quickly prepared a bed for him inside the temple, covered him with a blanket to keep him warm, and gave him some medicine. Canoe was delirious for some time, talking gibberish, but soon fell asleep. We then started preparations for our dinner. The plans for a barbecue were canceled, and we decided to have a simple dinner consisting of rice and lentils and hit the sack. By around 10 p.m., we finished our dinner, which tasted so good since we were all really famished after our long, hard day. The three of us sat down, chatting by the temple, and the topic soon drifted to the hauntings which were reported earlier. Nikhil is a complete non-believer in ghosts and scoffed at the reports. He also told us that he could go to the pond right away, enjoy a smoke, and spend half an hour there without any fear. Despite my pleas, he left us, promising to return in exactly half an hour. Peru and I were concerned about the whole thing, but couldn't help it. We started chatting about the breathtaking scenery from the fort and forgot about Nikhil. Time passed quickly, and when I glanced at my watch, it was 11 already. It was around an hour since Nikhil had left, and we hadn't heard from him. Irritated at his irresponsible behavior and being concerned about his well-being at the time, we immediately set about to find him. As we neared the pond, we saw Nikhil lying near the water. From a distance, it looked as if he had dozed off. When we came near, I glanced at his face. Believe me, what I saw next still sends a shiver down my spine. He was lying on his back with his eyes open, as if in a trance, staring straight at the sky. Fearing the worst, we shook him vigorously to try and get him out of his stupor. Fortunately for us, he awoke and seemed fine. He started sweating profusely and told us what exactly had happened. After leaving the temple, he came to the pond and was enjoying his smoke. He suddenly got the feeling that he wasn't alone. He saw something move in the bushes. He brushed aside his fear, saying to himself that it might be a stray dog who had made the fort his home. It also came to his mind that Peru and I might be playing a prank on him. He ignored the movement and continued smoking. He suddenly felt an icy cold hand on his neck. He swung back instantly and saw that it was a woman dressed in a red dress, horribly disfigured, unkempt hair swaying across her face, and a creepy smile on her face, looking straight at him. He had no recollection of what happened later until the time we woke him. There was an outline of 3 fingers clearly visible on Nico's neck where the cold hand touched him. Without wasting any more time, we ran to the temple. We were relieved to see Canoe sleeping soundly. My watch showed the time as 12:30 a.m., a half an hour past midnight. We entered the temple and closed the door securely from inside. All of us were visibly disturbed after what had happened. Out of sheer exhaustion, we were about to fall off to sleep when we suddenly heard a knock on the door. We did not have the courage to open the door, but the knocking still persisted, slowly at first and becoming more and more vigorous later on. Someone was banging on the doors and windows of the temple. We heard a woman's voice abusing us and daring us to come outside. Nikhil slowly opened the window in an attempt to see who it was. There was no one to be seen, but we could clearly hear the woman's voice abusing us. After around 20 minutes, the banging stopped. Just when we felt that the worst was over, it started all over again. This time, the banging and abuses continued with increased intensity for around 45 minutes before it finally ceased. All of us had become nervous wrecks. It seemed that the only thing which was preventing the evil entity outside from coming in was the presence of the deity inside the temple. None of us could sleep. All of us sat around the deity and prayed hard in such a way that we had never done before. Getting out of the fort safely was the only thing going through our minds at that time. Then, at around 6 a.m. in the morning, there was a knock on the door. This time, it was a man's voice asking us to open the door. Gradually mustering up courage, I opened the window and was relieved to find that it was the temple priest who had come there before to perform his religious duties. He was surprised to find us there since no one generally stayed in the fort after sundown. We related our account to him and he confirmed that a few others too had similar experiences during their stay. He told us that he had been coming to the fort since he was a child, but personally did not experience anything weird inside the fort. Since the start of our ordeal, Canoe was the only person who was sleeping comfortably inside the temple and did not wake up even once. In fact, when we woke him in the morning, he was feeling fit and fine, unlike the previous day. He had absolutely no recollection of our ordeal inside the temple. We quickly packed our stuff and immediately started back. Nikhil was lucky to have escaped unhurt. This incident left a deep mark on him and completely changed his perspective of looking at paranormal occurrences. He recovered soon and the marks on his neck vanished within a week. Canoe still doesn't remember anything from the time we came out of the pond until the next day. Peru and I still meet up occasionally and sometimes discuss as to what might have happened if we had opened the door of the temple that night. I'm an Ohio State Police patrolman, and on July 23rd, 2009, I was on patrol in Clark County. I was on my way to the Clark County OSP barracks to deliver paperwork on a case that was continued from Union County. While en route, everything flashed on my unit and my car stalled, but I was able to coast to a farmhouse on this county road I was traveling on. I coasted my unit into the driveway and saw an elderly gentleman walking out by the barn. He looked my way but continued into the barn. I tried to get my unit started, but it was completely dead. After trying to reach dispatch on the radio with no luck, I noticed a high-powered pole transmission line adjacent to the property. I knew my handheld was useless unless I got far enough away, so I opted to try to use the farmer's phone since I couldn't get a cell phone signal either. I walked out to the barn where the old man had entered and hollered hello. As I was opening what appeared to be the door to the milk parlor, looking in, I again hollered hello, a little louder than before. Not hearing anything, I turned to walk to the house to see if maybe I had missed him. But as I turned around, he was standing behind me, which, I'll admit, startled me a little. The man had no expression on his face when he asked if I was having car trouble, to which I replied, yes, and asked to borrow his phone. He pointed towards the house and told me we could walk there, or use the milk parlor if I wasn't going to be long because he was getting ready to milk and asked me if I wanted some water while I waited. I said yes and thanked him, and then proceeded to tell him that the parlor would suffice. I followed him into the barn and he walked out through the barn while I used his phone. I told dispatch where I was and to dispatch a wrecker, and was told they would have a wrecker out in under 60 minutes. As I hung the phone up, the farmer was coming out, wiping his hands on a grease rag where he said he was working on the pump motor for the milking machine. I told him what dispatch had said, to which he said, let him push my car to the road so they will find it. I told him if it wasn't in the way, they could grab it there, to which he replied, nay, they never look in the driveway, so we best push it to the road. He told me I could set my glass on the picnic table, then to get in and steer and he would push. Since it was on a downhill slope, he pushed it fairly easily. Once, on the edge of the road, I sat with my cruiser until the tow truck shows. The driver gets out of the truck and is looking up at the farm, all nervous, and says, we need to hurry and get out of here. I assured him all was okay. When we arrived at the barracks garage, everyone was standing around outside. Everyone acted concerned about my well-being, asked how my adventure went at the farm. I said it went fine. Well, did you talk to the old farmer? Everyone wanted to know. I said he didn't chat very much, and he helped me push my unit to the street. Everyone went and looked at the patrol car, now released from the wrecker. I said, what's the big deal? The wrecker driver looked at me and said, you don't know? I said, no. So he told me that in the early 70s, a farmer shot himself in the milk parlor of that old farm, and nobody has lived there since mid-80s due to it being haunted.
I said, "No way." An officer told me to jump in his patrol car and we'll drive out there. Long story short, it was a rundown, abandoned farm with dust and cobwebs everywhere and not a living soul anywhere. I had him pull into the driveway, and there, sitting on the table, was my glass where he had told me to set it. I walked to the barn and the milk house was covered in dust, but oddly enough, the phone had fresh prints like it had been used. I picked the phone off of the cradle and no dial tone whatsoever, which really startled me, and I said, "We can go now." But he, being a paranormal hunter on the side, was full of questions. When we arrived back at the barracks, my car was repaired. It turned out the positive cable came off of the starter, and where the old man pushed my car were greasy handprints. I have driven back there, and the house is gone. Apparently, someone torched it, but to this day, it still gives me the heebie-jeebies. My grandpa is 73 years old, and one thing I would know about him is that he would never tell a lie. My grandpa's grandpa owned a farm in South Dakota, where he is from, and just a little ways from his farm was a bar, and you had to walk about a mile on a dirt path to get there. Now, in my grandpa's time, teenagers, my grandpa was, at the time, 15, could go into a small town bar at any time, whenever they wanted, because they needed the business. So, at about 9 p.m., in the middle of the summertime, my grandpa and his brother, Warren, went out to the bar to shoot pool. They did not have a drop of alcohol, and once they were done, it was about 11:30 p.m. They were walking slowly. Warren was on crutches, and talking to each other when Warren noticed something. They noticed a tall, black figure walking and stepping when they stepped, parallel to my grandpa's feet. My grandpa threw some rocks at it, but nothing happened. As it seemed, the rocks would go right through this figure. My grandpa, scared, ran as fast as he could, but forgot Warren behind him, and the figure disappeared. They hurried to their grandpa's farm, going as fast as they could, and eventually got there around 12:30 a.m. Now, this is where it gets really eerie. When my grandpa got into the house, he locked the door behind him, but as they were trying to imagine what was that thing, something was tugging on the door. Their grandpa, fast as wind, went to the door with a gun in his hand. But as he opened the door, nothing was there. Tomorrow morning, they found small footprints exactly where my grandpa saw this figure, which is abnormal for how tall this thing was. Oddly enough, there wasn't any footprints next or in front of the house. Their house was in the middle of nowhere. There was not anyone at the bar except the manager, who was short and was there when they left, and, of course, themselves. And that was the only thing in circumference to the farm. It was an extremely low chance that a human could have been there that fateful night. I have always been a skeptic when it comes to believing in ghosts, spirits, and the paranormal. Raised in a family of doctors and scientists, such ideas were never encouraged at our home. I'm currently living in Mumbai, working for a large corporate firm, and my parents live in Bangalore. Of course, this is all located in India, which I live. A couple of months back, I took a 2-week leave to visit my grandmother, who has not been well and lives in a village in a mud house. She just refuses to come to Bangalore to stay with my parents. The urban air stifles her completely. It was June and hot, the typical Indian summer. That particular night, it was a full moon and exceptionally quiet. 7 p.m., and the entire village was already tucked into their homes, with not a soul in the streets. My childhood friend, who lives in the same village, had come over to see me. We were talking about how the grass is always greener on the other side. She's married with a baby and me, a single career woman who lives alone in the big city. Somehow we fell into talking about spirits and ghosts. She narrated a legend of the ghost of 2 lovers having been taken place about 70 years ago. India was in the middle of turmoil, fighting for independence from the British. My grandmother's village, however, was, and still is, largely unaffected by changes happening outside its borders. Although cell phones and computers can be found now, thank God for that. The village is predominantly inhabited by people of a certain community. Only the fringes housed believers of other faiths. It so happened that around the year of 1942, the rich headman's teenage daughter fell in love, madly and passionately, with a young farmer boy of another faith. The boy, too, reciprocated her feelings, but was too scared to take any step for the sake of the both of them. In India, interreligious marriage was, and frankly still is, taboo. Still, for the sake of their love, they decided to elope to the city and be together. Unlucky as it was, they were intercepted at the train station by the girl's brothers and brought back. The girl was locked up and forcibly married off to an old man, while the boy was beaten to death and his body left in the rice fields to rot. Having got the news of her lover's death, the girl hung herself in her bedroom and vowed to return every full moon with her beloved haunt the village. From that year onwards, every full moon night, the spirits of the young lovers are seen holding hands and roaming in the rice fields. Once my friend narrated this story to me, I burst out laughing, pretty sure that if the lovers are still seen, it is the only handiwork of people alive who want to keep the legend going. She seemed offended by my outburst and challenged me to visit the fields that night. It was coincidentally a full moon. Initially refusing, I agreed later. Sharp at midnight, we took off. We had no lights. She insisted that it was for our own safety. As we left the village and walked towards the rice fields, I could feel a heavy air descend on me. I don't know if she too felt it or not, but we didn't talk about it anyway. Before we reached the rice fields, we encountered sugarcane fields. The grown sugarcanes were taller than me. Walking through them has the same sounds as someone walking over dried leaves. I could see my friend walking beside me, but I felt there was someone behind us as well. When I signaled the same to her with my fingers, she just asked me to be quiet and move on. Soon after, we were in the rice fields. It was 12:38 a.m. and we waited. Another 15 minutes and still nothing. Bored, I signaled to her that it's time to get back. What happened next, I will never forget. I can vouch what I saw was real and not my imagination. You have to believe it coming from someone who was a non-believer. I felt a chill within my body and 2 white smoke-like silhouettes. One, a girl, the other, a boy, holding hands, appeared in front of my eyes. It was like they were walking on their own way, and I happened to be walking in front of them, rather them following us. They walked on and through my body, hence the eerie chill, and moved ahead to the rice fields, very much in love. I was stunned into silence and was mesmerized to see the smoke silhouettes gliding around the fields. I knew what I saw was no human, who was just trying to keep the legend alive. My friend showed me her watch. It was 2:30 a.m. We walked back in silence. I left for the city the next afternoon, having mentioned nothing to my grandmother. But as I left the village, I could swear that I had a nasty feeling, as if I am leaving someone behind. It's been more than a year now, and believe it or not, I want to go back and see them again. Thanks for reading. I've lived in the same town all my life. It's small and in the middle of the countryside, south of England. Around 2 years ago, me and a friend of mine called Lisa decided to go for a walk to this place we called the cow fields. To get to the cow fields, you have to go down a long, thin road that hasn't been used for years, surrounded by trees either side. The reason we go there is because of how beautiful it is, with all the rolling hills and streams. When we got to the fields, it was around 3:30 p.m. in the winter. We had about 2 hours of light left to explore around there. We sat on a small hill that has a stream to the right, and it curves around in front of you where there is a bridge to some fields to get back to the roads. I was looking over to the trees behind the stream in front, talking to Lisa and having a smoke, when I saw a figure. He was holding on to the trees, swaying back and forth in the wind with them, but it was more jaggedy. I didn't say anything to Lisa because I thought it was just my imagination, but it wasn't like I looked over and he disappeared. He was in the trees always, never left my sight. He'd sometimes move from tree to tree, hunched over and limping as he walked. It was quite far away, but I could still make out that he was wearing some kind of cap. It just looked like the shadow of a man. I noticed Lisa was looking over in that direction. I was panicking, but due to my mental health history, I didn't put it past just a lapse in my recovery. Lisa seemed to quiet down and started staring over in that direction. That's when I suggested we left. I wasn't sure what would happen, as we had to walk towards the figure to leave the fields. Both me and Lisa were hesitant. As we walked towards the bridge, the figure faded away. I was now 100% sure it was just me, and I had been making myself thinking Lisa had seen something, when in reality, she was just looking at the trees and daydreaming. We walked through the remainder of the fields and got back to the road. As soon as we stopped on the road, I saw faces. I don't know how to explain it, but they were in the trees next to me. It looked as if someone had taken a picture with a slow exposure time as someone turned their head, but they were all moving, so blurred and gray, with their mouths gaping open. That was the last straw for me. I turned to Lisa, who was frantically looking side to side. I couldn't not say anything. I remember just thinking and talking so fast, like it burst out of me. I said, Are you seeing this?"
Without saying anything, she started sprinting down the road. I followed. She was in front of me by far. I looked behind me, and I saw the figure from the trees standing around 15 meters away from me. I ran faster. I turned around again a minute later, and there was nothing there. I slowed down because I just couldn't keep that pace up. I saw Lisa frantically looking at me over her shoulder. I looked behind me again, and the figure was there. He was probably around 4 meters behind me this time, just standing there whilst I ran further away. I didn't want to look back again because I feared how close he would be. I kept running when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. Whatever was standing behind me now was now running next to me through the trees. I could see the cap on his head. The strange thing was, I couldn't see him if there was a gap in the trees, only when it was close to the trees. I finally got to the end of the road, and we were under a lamplight when we had started running. It was only just starting to get dark. Within about 3 minutes, it was almost pitch black. Before I had a chance to tell Lisa what I had just seen, she was crying hysterically, saying, "It was right behind you. He was standing right behind you." She also started talking about the faces and the man in the hat. I don't know what we saw, but I have never gone back to those fields. As a kid, I had often been afraid of things that go bump in the night. I remember this happening ever since my parents had divorced, back in 1965, when I was 4 or 5 years old, and my mom was raising my younger brother and I as a single mom. Maybe the divorce made me insecure and frightened of things in general. I'm not talking about anything I could pinpoint as ghostly. Mostly, I was just terrified of noises I heard or thought I had heard. Footsteps outside my window, logically explained as this was when I had lived in an apartment complex. I lived in many places as a child, and later on, thinking I would hear someone walking on our carpet in the hallway in the middle of the night. Something was always seeming to be scaring me though. For instance, when I was 5, I was temporarily living with my grandparents right after my mom had moved us to Arizona from Texas. One morning, I woke up on the floor next to my bed, although that didn't particularly frighten me since I had figured I simply had fallen off the bed. During the night, I do remember another night waking up and calling out for my aunt in a panic because I swear something was shaking my bed. She came in and lay down with me for a few moments. The shaking stopped after that and never repeated itself. She explained to me I was having a nightmare, which I matter-of-factly accepted, and which also left me with the impression for years afterwards that one had to be fully awake to experience a nightmare. To this day, although I know now I was not dreaming, I still don't know why my bed was shaking like that. Since this happened in Mesa, Arizona, it was not likely to have been caused by an earthquake either. Fast forward about 10 years. My mom had remarried another man who became our legal father when he adopted my brother and I. We lived in a ranch-style house, which were very common in the Southwest in the 60s and 70s, and that my folks had purchased and built as a brand new tract home several years earlier. So this isn't a story about moving into some mysterious and really old home with a lot of weird vibes.
It was just your typical new home that everyone seemed to be moving into back in the days of early suburban sprawl in the Phoenix area. Like I said, I had always been afraid of noises, and I was always imagining hearing footsteps on the carpet outside the doorway. I never saw or heard anything else. I was just creeped out by thinking I had heard footsteps. In my honest opinion, the ventilation coming from the central heating and air conditioning was probably the most likely culprit. When my dad was assigned to go overseas in 1974, I did see something that terrified the living daylights out of me. I was a freshman in high school. By then, I had mostly gotten over the footsteps on the carpet heebie-jeebies. My mom, out of habit, began to leave the kitchen lights on at night. I slept with my door open because the light coming in from the hallway offered a sense of warmth and comfort, as it probably did my mom. Except, on this particular night, I remember waking up, looking at my little red travel alarm clock I always kept by the bed. I could see it was exactly 1:20 a.m. For some reason, I glanced over at my door, and what I saw literally petrified me. From the diffused kitchen lighting, I could see the distinct shadow of a human form cast onto the hallway wall outside my bedroom. What was even more particularly frightening to me was that this wasn't just a shadow that happened to look like a figure. It was actually moving slowly towards my bedroom door. And to make it even more terrifying, I could hear footsteps on the carpet as it came closer. I could only watch in utter horror because I was not in any way thinking that this was a ghost I was seeing, but a real flesh and blood intruder that had broken into our home and was sneaking into one of our rooms to attack us. But I was way too scared to scream or do anything but watch and wait for this person to show up in front of my doorway. But that didn't happen. The shadow just stopped advancing and faded away. I could only sit and stare at my doorway for what seemed the longest time, but nothing else happened. Finally, all I could do was jump out of bed, run across the hallway, which was empty of any intruder, and into my mom's room and wake her up to tell her what I had seen. In her half-asleep state, she brushed it off to my overactive imagination. I fell into a fitful sleep next to her, and when I checked the doors and windows the next morning, everything was secure, so I pretty much didn't think about it much after that. Except, that isn't quite the end of the story. About a year later, after my dad was back home from his overseas assignment, I woke up again late one Saturday night and heard someone moving around in the kitchen hallway and could see their shadows as they moved about, cast onto the hallway from the kitchen light, which was left on. I knew it was probably my dad, since he had a habit of falling asleep on the couch in front of the TV. Long after sign-off, the stations would end their broadcast for the evening, and the station would be off the air with nothing but static on the channel. So I thought he was just getting up to go to bed, but I didn't hear anything else, so I got up to see what he was doing. When I walked into the kitchen, no one was there, but at the end of the room, which was our family room off from the kitchen, my dad was sound asleep and snoring in front of the TV, which was just showing static since it was off the air. The weird part was, it looked like he hadn't moved in hours, let alone a few minutes ago. That is when I started to get a very creepy feeling about what I just saw and how it wasn't jiving with what I was seeing now. I could only run back to my room and try not to think about it. I haven't had any other experiences with seeing shadow figures and would tend not to believe in the paranormal if it wasn't for all the stories I've heard, not just on the internet, but from my friends and family. But that was just a little too weird for me to ignore as something just being my imagination and don't have any clue what it was I was seeing all those years ago. It's not as exciting as other stories I've read here, but I remember being scared so badly at the time that I am at least grateful it's not something I've had to deal with as a regular occurrence throughout my life. I encountered this entity quite a few months ago, close to the beginning of the month while walking my dog, but the experience stays fresh in my mind no matter how many days come to pass, for it still leaves me uneasy. It was on a clear night with a full moon that I decided to take my dog on a walk due to not being able to fall back asleep. I pulled on a simple jacket to keep me warm in my shirt and pajama pants, let my dog out of her kennel to clip on her leash, and left my home quietly as my family slept. It was in the early morning hours that I had woken up, but it wasn't the first time, so this was a somewhat normal occurrence for me at that point. I thought that it was just going to be a simple walk down the street to the mailbox and back. Boy, was I wrong. It was silent as I made my way down our dirt road. Not even the birds were making noises in the trees as I walked past and would have normally woken them up. My dog Tess would let out an uneasy whine every now and again, but I just took it as her being the scaredy dog she was, and probably was whining about her own shadow. As we neared the end of the street, only about 10 or so feet away from the mailbox, she suddenly started moving in closer to me, and I felt my vision almost vibrate as I turned my head due to suddenly feeling like something was pressing down on me while a loud buzzing filled my head. I don't know why, for it was sort of instantaneous with the sudden buzzing and pressure I was feeling in my head, but I glanced to the side and saw something standing in the bushes on the side of the road. It looked like a man, and yet not. It had no clothes on and was tall with rather long limbs and sickly white skin that just the sight alone almost made me want to throw up. The thing's face is what scared me the most, I believe, for it had no nose but piercing yellow eyes and a leering grin of a smile on its wide mouth that looked like it almost split from ear to ear, though not quite. Other than these features in its body shape, there was nothing else to identify it as a male. Not that I really had time to double check, as it disappeared and the pressure and buzzing noise went away. Once it did, I could hear Tess freaking out as she tried to slip out of her leash while backing up and whining loudly. But I quickly turned and ran back home with her following, then running ahead. Once I was home and in my room, I instantly jumped back into bed and pulled the blankets over my head to feel safe again, as I realized just how much that thing had scared me. To this day, I don't know what I saw, nor have I seen it again, but thinking back on my experience, I don't think I want to. It was Easter Sunday, 1992. I was 7 years old. All of my mom's brothers and sisters and their children had gathered at my maternal grandmother's house, like usual. After lunch, the adults had an egg hunt for all the kids. Anyway, the egg hunt was over, and all my cousins and I were headed to the backyard to collect our prizes. For some reason, I stopped about 20 yards short of the group and stared at the hillside. The back of my grandmother's backyard was, and still is, lined with forsythia bushes. The bushes were not in full bloom, but were starting to bloom. From what I remember about the sun, it had to have been around 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Anyway, as I stared into the bush, this white shape, neither solid nor transparent, started forming out of nowhere. It seemed to be spinning while it expanded and contracted. At this time, I became aware that there was a very tall presence behind me, almost touching me. I thought the presence was my older cousin, who was a teenager and twice my height. So I spun around and said, "Lee, look at that," and spun back around. Instantaneously, I realized that Lee was not behind me and never had been, and the white blob was gone. I felt alone again. I looked over and realized my family was some distance off and had not seen or noticed a single thing. I think it needs to be said now that I am very skittish. I'm terrified of the dark and always have been. Just the thought of possibly seeing a ghost or demon or presence scares me. I've always been like that. However, in this situation, I was calm, more than calm. I know at some point in time, I told my mother, grandmother, aunt, and father about this. For a long time, they tried to convince me that what I saw was a cat or a grocery bag in the wind. I always maintained that it was an unknown form. Years passed, and my mother would occasionally bring this topic up with me to see if I remembered anything else. My story has always been the same. However, she pointed out something about 6 months ago that I had never realized. For years, I'd put emphasis on the blob. It had never occurred to me that I had not been mistaken about my cousin's presence behind me. Perhaps I just couldn't see the presence. Then she suggested that the presence could have been her father. He had died when my mother was 5 or 6. My mother and I are practically identical, so much so that in my adult life, I've seen pictures of her and thought they were me. My mother suggests that the presence was her father, just checking up on his little girl. For some reason, this helped put the mystery of why I saw the blob to bed. Now I feel like I understand, or at least have a more complete understanding.
This was way before I was born. It happened to my dad when he was in his early 20s. If you knew me, you'd know that once I get interested in something like this, I won't drop it until I figure out its meaning. I think it's both a good thing and a bad thing. Anyway, his wife and a couple of his friends were bored one night. His wife, at the time, isn't my mom, by the way. His friend thinks that they should get out the Ouija board since none of them believed in it, and of course mess with it. He says he regrets it now, and he also says that by messing with that thing, you don't know what you're talking to, so you shouldn't mess with it. I mean, it's just like talking to a stranger, a really scary, dangerous stranger. His friends and wife start to play with it, and he falls asleep on the couch because it was really late. When he wakes up the next morning, he said he was flipping through the book where they wrote what it said, and stopped horrified. He said he saw a name in it. Belzebub was the name. He was scared, so he went and asked his wife what they asked it last night. She said that was what came up when they asked its name. He was too scared to flip through the rest of the book because he was afraid of what else it probably said. He also looked into this. Did it make you-know-who mad? He only mentioned that name once, and it's a name I hate to say, especially since I know who this is. He only mentioned it once because he said the power of a name, once mentioned, could draw attention to yourself if you say it way too many times. And of course, I would hate that. Weird things have always happened since. He also told me when he was asleep that night, he had a very freaky dream. He said he'd rather not describe it to me, but it was a terrible nightmare. Weird things have happened to me as well. In the middle of the night, I would get this weird feeling I was being watched. Then when I would try to look, it would look like something quickly fleeing. And also another time, not too long ago, I was lying in my bed thinking, and I heard something say to me, "Hi, Carrie." That's my name. If you didn't know, it came up close to my ear and whispered it. It freaked me out pretty bad, and it was when I felt like I was being watched. When I looked back to see, something did that weird stalk and flee thing. I don't think I can ever remember being harmed by it physically though. This has stuck with me throughout my life too. This happened at our old house as well, and it's followed me to my second house where I live today. I've looked into these things before. Any tips or advice? I don't like things that I don't know, that are watching me in my room or when I sleep. The Stalking Wolf. Ever since I was a little girl, I've been followed by a large black dog that looks rather similar to a wolf. I'm not really sure if it's a paranormal entity of sorts or a ghost, a shape-shifting or whatnot. But if I'm going for a walk, it will follow behind me. A couple of times, it has actually walked beside me. No one else sees it but me. Sometimes I think I'm going crazy. Every time I visit the graveyard, it's there. I've never tried petting it, and I've never talked to it. Should I? It doesn't exactly scare me, but I'm not sure if I should be worried of this paranormal creature. I don't have any friends, so I get extremely lonely and depressed. It's kind of nice having it around, and when I don't see it, I kind of miss it. It has bright yellow eyes, and sometimes I'll see it from afar, just staring. Maybe it's my guardian. I've heard about guardians before, but I never really believed it. A couple of months ago, I was having a panic attack. I felt like I was dying. Then I saw the black dog come out from the shadows of my room. I thought I was imagining it, but then it got extremely close to me, and instead of feeling alarmed, I felt calm. I just laid there, feeling tired and relaxed as it sat beside me, and I fell asleep. If anyone could tell me what it is or if it wants anything, please let me know. Will it follow me for the rest of my life? Do ghosts follow you from house to house? My husband and I own a two-family home in southeastern Massachusetts, which we lived in until October of 2007. There are too many details to write about concerning the otherworldly going-ons in that house, which eventually led to my calling New England Paranormal Society. And in early 2005, they did investigate, in fact. We received confirmation of 2 ghosts in that house. Note, it took me almost 3 years to contact investigators. I kept thinking there must be a logical explanation to what was happening. Fast forward to 2007, my husband and I bought a house a mile away and moved into it. We began to experience similar activities, lights being turned on when we weren't home, bathroom water running when neither of us had turned it on. About a month ago, August 2009, I went to the spare room to have a phone conversation with my daughter. When I entered the room, I noticed that, once again, the stand-up fan in that room was running, and per usual, my husband's son denied having it turned on. I unplugged the fan from the wall, sat on the bed, and continued on with my approximate 10-minute conversation. When the conversation ended and I hung up the phone, I noticed the fan was plugged back in and running. I thought to myself, did I get off the bed during that 10 minutes? Plug it in and not remember? Some months ago, my husband went upstairs and noticed the water in the bathroom sink was running. He turned the faucet off and came back downstairs to ask that I please turn the water off when I'm done. However, he never did mention it because we passed like ships in the night, as I went directly upstairs to take a shower. When I went into the bathroom, I noticed the water was running and turned it off. I brought this to the attention that he had left the water running and to be more mindful to turn it off. He then explained to me that the water was running when he went upstairs, right before I did. He then turned it off, and he had meant to tell me to be more mindful to make sure I turn off the faucet. Neither of us had turned the water on, and there was no one else. Is this just all a big coincidence? But how could it be exactly? That wouldn't make much sense. I think they follow us. My name is Mimi. For a while now, me and my family have experienced a lot of ghost-like situations in which my sister's mother and I have all seen things that cannot be explained. We have moved due to different complications, but it never fails. It always feels like we weren't the only ones living in our homes, or always being watched. A few years ago, we rented out this house that we didn't really do research on the property. Maybe a big mistake on our part, but nothing really happened at first. But a few months after settling in, we then knew that we were not the only ones living there. My sister, who is 5 years younger than I, would complain that she heard voices and seen shadow-like things walking through the walls, or from the corner of her eye. My youngest sister had an imaginary friend who turned out to be evil. She said her name was Jeetus. My sister would say wild things that Jeetus would say, like, "Jeetus wants to kill you." We later found out from our neighbor who has lived next door for like 30 years that a male had passed away in the house. Myself personally have been woken up by this man, which his old room was my room actually. He was turning on and off my TV. After a few times he was standing in the doorway and said, "Okay, I'll let you sleep now," and walked out of my room. I moved out with my husband, who isn't really into these kind of things, so he always thinks that I'm overthinking or that I watch too many movies. At our apartment, when my husband would be at work, I once again start feeling like something is watching me. One night, I was asleep and woke up to this little girl in my room. As soon as she sees me awake, she runs out the room. That is the second time I have personally seen her. Me and my husband move into my mom's new house to help around while she works nights. The whole house feels the same thing as the previous house. My husband and I moved back with my mom to help her with my sisters while she works nights. We always see shadows and see things from the corner of the eye. We hear voices and people walking around the house and playing on the stairs. Last night, for example, my mom got home around 12 a.m. and I was still awake. My younger sisters were sleeping and my husband is out to sea. I sat in the living room with my mom and I heard a knock at the back door. I looked and saw a shadow walk past me. My mom didn't see at first and claimed that I was bugging her. She checked and there was nothing outside. I went to sleep, and about an hour later, my mom hears the same knocking at the door 3 times and was too scared to check. Our dog also stares at things and seems like she gets stuck, and we can never figure out what has got her attention. My question to anybody willing to answer or reply: could this thing have followed us? Is there something we should be worried about? And has anyone been through something similar? Could it be that my family has a special eye for this kind of thing? I don't know, but one thing is for certain: this is creeping me out. The ghost that follows. I guess it started when I was 4 years old, with a bad fever, and very, very sick. My mother says I popped up straight and stared at the end of my bed and asked, "Who is that lady on my bed?" Since then, I've always felt a presence my entire life. I know now I am never alone. Not ever. My entire life, every time I feel danger, something or someone tells me what to do. It is all in my head. I do not hear voices, I just listen to what I'm told. I get warnings regularly and most of the time follow their lead, but sometimes I do not. I'm often given the answers to many questions in my head, questions I would have no idea of knowing. This entity has followed me my entire life, even going so far as to hiding my keys in coffee cups. The entity I feel is a friend. They joke and play. I have never felt threatened by any means, but more comforted. The funny part is, I am atheist, and so I find myself somewhat mystified by the behavior and reason for this attachment. I am not afraid of it, but I've gotten used to it. I'm just wondering if anyone else has had a following of spirits of sorts, or if anyone had similar stories. It only spoke to me one time when I was walking down a street, and the only word it said was "stop." I looked around and saw no one that seemed to be paying me any attention, but I stopped anyway. I saw a bench and went to sit down, just to relax for a moment. Nothing happened. I saw nothing. I waited about 10 minutes and then stood up on my way. To this day, I do not know why I was supposed to stop, but I did, since learning to trust the entity that has bound itself to me for so many years seems like a logical thing to do at the time. I'm 51 now and the entity is still at large. I suppose I should or will not know what it is there for, but I just thought I would share. Unborn baby still follows me. My name is Yasmin. I have 2 kids, a daughter that is 5 and a son that is 2. I will call them A and L for short. Before I got pregnant with my daughter A, I suffered a miscarriage. I was about a couple months along. Very sad. I got really depressed. Then I found out I was pregnant with my daughter A. Nothing really started to happen until after I had my son L. They are 3 years apart. So let's say it's been about 6 years since my miscarriage. After I had my son L, weird things started happening around my house. Sometimes I would hear a child say, "Mama, Mama," in a whisper. Sometimes, when the house was real quiet, I could hear a child running in the hall, when in fact, I know they were sleeping. Miscarriage happened in a different place, not the same house. Then, I started to hear a baby crying. I thought it was my baby, so I would rush to check on him, but he would be sound asleep, practically snoring. I started to think, why, at that moment, did my baby that I lost start reaching out to me? Was it because it was a boy? And that's why I didn't hear anything with my daughter. I also felt as though a little person would fall asleep in my arms, touch my hand, and kiss my cheek. This was when my baby was barely even born. It stopped for a while, until now in 2014. I was driving, and my kids were in the back. All of a sudden, I hear someone whispering, but I can't make it out. I thought my daughter was trying to tell me something, so I asked, "What is it?" She said she didn't say anything, so I brushed it off, but I kept hearing something. And then I heard someone, a child, say, "Mama." Is my child trying to communicate with me?
Hey Phantom, so first of all, please let me know in the comment section below if you got to the end of this video. Leave a comment. That way I know you enjoyed the compilation, and it's been a great compilation for you guys. Merry Christmas. You can share the video. You can leave a like, because that helps, of course. And I hate saying that, but that's for the algorithm. If the algorithm likes me, it'll include me if I say that. And you guys do it, so I appreciate it. And you guys are the best Christmas gift of all. Thank you so much. I need to fix my laryngitis, guys. Love you.